Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
So we are going to start tonight's budget work session. The agenda is informally as follows. We'll be talking about the proposed budget. If there are any questions, talk about budget questions in particular. There'll be a presentation on recommendations regarding large class sizes for elementary schools, and then we'll review the budget schedule. And I'd like to start by asking Dr. Garza if she has any opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Reed, members of the board. And I do again want to reiterate how much we appreciate the very hard work of our budget chair and vice chair, Ms. Reed and Ms. Smith. And of course, board members, you all have been very much engaged in this process, and we appreciate your interest. And of course, our financial services team and all of our leadership team who have put in just countless hours and done great work for us. I would like to just comment on some of the comments that were made tonight. I know that we were all listening intently to some of the very compelling comments and thoughts from constituents, employees. I just wanted to reiterate that this budget does not include cuts to staffing. Certainly, we're very sensitive to the fact that we have asked our employees to do so much, all of our employees. And the point that was made about how important our support staff is to our operations of our schools is certainly something that we all recognize. I think our teachers also and our principals also recognize how important every employee is to our system. But there are no cuts to staff in this budget. We are proposing a salary increase for our employees, and we're urging that it is fully funded, because that 3.99% increase to the transfer, the lion's share, the largest percentage of that is really for the purpose of compensation increases for our employees. And so I think we're all very mindful of the fact that if this budget is not fully funded, the very hard decisions that we're going to have to wrestle with, knowing that our employees, we've lost ground and we've got to do better. I also want to just make a comment with regard to the 3 days, because I think it's important for our community to understand. The 3 days that were, we reduced instructional days from 183 to 180. Those 3 days are still in the calendar, but for the purpose of professional development and teacher planning. So the teacher contract days did not change. The contracts still remain 194 days. So if we were to add back the 3 instructional days, automatically our teachers, our staff, our schools would have 3 less days for planning and the opportunity to collaborate and work on schools. And some of that's teacher work time. So I'm mindful, and I think the point was certainly a good one, but it's not as easy. And by the way, the reduction of 1.3 in there was just a line contract. So it wasn't, we cut that, and that was a savings for us, if you know what I'm saying. It wasn't, it was something that was going to help us make ends meet, obviously, but it wasn't for the purpose of saving money. It was an end result of making the change to full day Mondays that we were able to save those dollars. So I just wanted to be clear about that. I know that Kristen Michaels, who will be coming up and talking about some major points around the budget, some of it she'll be reiterating information that this board is well aware of, but just wanted to provide you an opportunity to ask questions. And she'll be talking about the high points again in terms of the calendar and the structure. And then we have Dr. Pajardo here to talk about just the high points of some of the changes that we've been working with our principals and around class size that I think you'll be very interested to hear about. I'd like to, when Dr. Pajardo, before you come up, I'd like to kind of tee you up. So whenever that's appropriate, if you'll provide me just a few minutes to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Michaels, who will kind of start our structured dialogue around the budget.
Okay, thank you so much. This evening, we wanted to just provide an opportunity to ensure that school board members can ask any questions that they would like regarding the proposed budget. We also wanted to take an opportunity to tell the school board members and the public that the budget questions that we've received to date are posted on the web and available for people to see. So if you go to our main budget webpage, our main FCPS webpage, fcps.edu, at the bottom of that page is a budget link, and that will take you to all of the budget documents for the proposed budget. So we have Dr. Garza's presentation posted, the budget document itself. There's now an audio version of the slides posted, which is a 17-minute approximate presentation that I really recommend for people who want to get an audio presentation of the budget, and then the questions and answers that have been asked and answered so far. So in terms of the budget, just to remind everyone, the budget is a $2.6 billion budget. That's a net increase of $64 million or 2.6% over the previous year. So when you look at that budget, there's expenditure increases that really support board priorities of salary increases, a market scale adjustment for all employees of 1%, and then a step increase for eligible employees. And then also key priorities in terms of later high school start times and funding that we're going to talk about this evening in terms of addressing large class sizes at elementary schools. We're very happy that this budget addresses that. Combined to offset those expenditure increases are reductions of $55 million. And as Dr. Garza noted, there are no increases in class size, no cuts to the number of employees. We really took a targeted approach to this year with a long-term view to be well prepared for FY17. So we're doing some targeted program reviews. We evaluated all of our centrally managed accounts or accounts that departments manage on behalf of the school system. So again, I welcome any questions you have on the proposed budget before we talk about our reduction or our adjustment to address class size at the elementary level.
Okay, does any board member have any questions on the proposed budget? Ms. Evans.
Yes, just to follow up with what some of the support employees had raised, and thank you, Dr. Garza, for explaining some of these things. The custodians came in and were talking about not cutting numbers, and Dr. Garza's answered that. Are there days or time being cut in this budget? Does it assume cuts in custodial time? Does it assume cuts in among other support employees?
Sure. When we look at the budget proposal for FY16, there's no reduction to the number of support positions. What you will see is due to the change in the student calendar, there's 3 fewer instructional days. So we do have contract length reductions proposed that impact primarily bus drivers and food service workers for next year. So those are contract length reductions of 3 days. But there are no reductions in terms of the number of custodian positions in the system.
Okay.
If I might add to that, I think probably what was being referred to tonight is in the fiscal year 15 budget, which is our current budget. You remember that at the end of, after we received the report from the Gibson, the state efficiency review, they proposed and recommended reductions in our custodial staffing, remember?
Right.
We did not cut to the extent that they recommended in our custodial staff, but we had to make some really hard decisions in the last budget. Fiscal year 15, I don't have to remind this board, we cut $98 million out of our operating budget. And those were very hard reductions and very tough decisions. So they were affected in the last budget, which is our current reality.
Right.
So what they're speaking of is the same thing that we're hearing from some of our teachers, and just is reductions that we made in last year's budget that they're feeling this year, I would imagine. Okay. So there were some reductions in custodial staffing for this school year in last year's budget.
Okay.
Correct. We increased the amount of square footage per custodian per the Gibson recommendations. And as Dr. Garza said, it was about 50% of that recommendation from the state efficiency review through Gibson Consulting. But what it means is custodians have more square footage to clean per custodian, so it's increased workload.
And lastly, but not least, on the parent liaisons, does this anticipate reduction in time of parent liaisons?
Parent liaisons are funded currently using hourly funding, and there's
Right.
no reduction in that funding. So they'll still have the same amount of funding that they can use. There'll be fewer student days, but there's no reduction to those hours related to the change in the calendar.
Okay, thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Moon.
As a quick follow-up on the custodian issues, we have a formula that basically you can, using the formula, we can figure out the number of custodians for each building. And that formula takes into consideration of not only the square footage of the building, but the number of students and staff members in the particular building, correct?
Correct. And in
So
addition,
compared to this year's number, if the enrollment goes up, number of people in a particular building goes up, next year, there is a potential for increase in number of custodians.
correct. We look at the number not only of students, but employees, and then also the community use impact.
Okay, thank
So
you.
all of those.
Thank you.
Mr. Moon makes a very good point. Much of the staffing is formula-driven, so if we don't, last year, any kind of cut we make to staffing, what we do, I think this is an important point, is we actually change the formulas that drive the staffing. Just like teacher class size, we change the formulas. So Mr. Moon is correct, as we continue to grow, as long as the formula does not change, we grow, then the custodial staff would commensurately increase. That's correct. Because we have to add teachers, and there's more classrooms to have to support.
Next, I have Ms. Hines.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on a conversation that you and I had by email a couple days ago about pre-K, because it's something that a lot of us always look for at budget time to see how well we're doing at chipping away, at the gap. Because every year that we don't close that gap is a huge missed opportunity, but we are in tough times, and we know that. But so in our exchange, you mentioned to me something that I guess I had heard and forgot, is that we actually are planning for new pre-K classrooms next year out of grant money. Would you mind explaining that to
I'd be happy to. Next school year, we're adding 2 additional pre-K classes using Title I funding. And then FCPS and the county won a federal grant that's going to allow FCPS to add 2 classrooms of students for pre-K, and the county will also serve an additional equivalent of 2 classes. So 4 on FCPS's side and 2 on the county.
Okay, so we're able to have six new classrooms for next fall, which is great. And I guess that doesn't really show up, I can't find it in the budget. Am I looking in the wrong place?
You're not looking in the wrong place. The grant that was won after the budget was prepared. And then when you look at the Title I funding, that is included in the grant section of the budget.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ms. Strauss.
I was out at Herndon High School this morning and having an extended conversation about some of our older level 1 ESOL students who are 18, 19, 20, et cetera, and obviously are very needy. I know that we get matching state funds for adult ESOL, and that would be students who are beyond the requirement to attend a high school. Have we looked at all into being able to get additional funding through any of those sources?
Dr.
don't.
Garza, do you want to talk at all about ESOL? When we look at state funding, we'll receive state funding based on all the students we have.
Right.
And we have projected an increase as we head into our
Right.
next year's budget in terms of those students, right? And then that will result in
Right.
additional
In
funding.
additional funding, but there is that other interesting piece for adult ESOL, and I don't know whether or not we've begun to look at that, because that could be a source of additional help, particularly for the older students who have particular needs.
Right, and we do provide adult ESOL services
Right.
through ACE, Adult and
Exactly.
Community Education. But I don't know how far we've looked into additional funding based on those numbers for next year.
Right, okay. And then my second question is, we know that there's been a court case involving BPOL taxes, and exactly what that may mean or not mean, and you may not have to answer it all tonight, but there will be curiosity as to whether or not this is something to worry about for FY 2016. Is this going to be a 2017 issue? Is there sort of a stopgap in the ability to have an impact? how far back, how far forward, et cetera?
Okay. BPOL is Business, Professional, and Occupational License Taxes. They're paid to Fairfax County government, not to FCPS.
Right.
In total, when you look at their budget for this year, the revenue from BPOL taxes in total is just over $150 million, which represents about 4% of their budget. The court case that you're referring to is the Virginia Supreme Court ruled on a case against Arlington County. Right, and the ruling impacts companies that are multi-state or multinational, and it has to do with how they classify receipts and where they're taxable. So when we've spoken to the county, they're still trying to determine the impact that that will have on the county because it's very significant in terms of going back and looking at all those various taxpayers and receipts, and it really does only impact those that are in multi-states or multinational jurisdictions. So when we look at that as a whole, we don't have any specifics in terms of the impact, but the county's working on it.
And is this likely to have an immediate impact, or would this be something that would unravel over time? Because I understand people have to apply.
Right, so this ruling goes back to 2012, so
Okay, so
people
there
will
is a
have to
limit on that.
apply, then that'll have to be determined. So I don't see an immediate impact, but again, the county's going to have to calculate what that potential impact or liability could be, and then those companies would need to file to receive it, I believe.
But it goes back to 2012. So
Correct.
there's a stop there. And then obviously going forward, however it is applied, or projected revenues going forward, it will have to be based on the new Supreme Court ruling.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question, Mrs. Strauss, did you have a potential next step regarding the adult ESOL?
Not yet, but it is, because I know that these are, I mean, how we're going to go forward to help serve this population. I would just recommend that we continue to look for that. That's not a huge source, but I know that we had talked about through some of our more traditional adult services where we have cut back on some of it because we didn't have clients. We now have some clients again, and then as to how we're going to rearrange this.
I won't go into all the details tonight,
Sure.
but we are looking at, we have a whole team looking
I
at,
assume.
as our population and their needs have changed,
Right.
particularly as we're looking at our high school students with these needs that you just described, we've got to have some different instructional designs
Right.
and different models. So we have a whole team working on that. We fully intend to be in a position to open at least two programs next year to see how well
Right.
they work and hopefully take them into more schools where we have that need. We know that adult ed is a piece of this too.
Exactly,
In terms of the overall solution. It's not just instructional design, instructional delivery models, but it's also really maximizing adult education.
Exactly.
And figuring out why is access in terms of proximity a challenge? Do we need to open more programs? And so we're trying to figure out what the barriers are to getting more of the students that may be more appropriately served in an adult ed setting into those settings. So we recognize it's a big piece of that overall
Right.
design.
Right, exactly.
moving
Thank you.
Okay, moving on, we have Mrs. McLaughlin, followed by Mr. McElveen and Mrs. Schultz.
So one of the things I was looking at with the agenda that was posted this evening, I appreciate all the things that have been put there for the board and for the public to look at. But in the key points, it provided these wonderful bullets that sort of listed out, okay, if we're looking at a $64 million increase over last year's budget, and that here are sort of the key drivers of that. And when you look at those 7 bullets, I added them up and they're about $101 million roughly. And then it's noted that we did an offset of budget reductions of $55 million. So coming out with about $46.5 million, I was trying to get a sense of what are the other costs, because in the end, the net need is $64 million. But I know the public also looks carefully at us in what our transfer request is to the Board of Supervisors, which is actually even higher than $64 million based on what they're giving us in the transfer. So without making it too complicated for you, would you mind just clarifying a little bit how those numbers are shaking out, because I think it would be really helpful that we're very clear in the end. This is the transfer amount that right now has been projected that we'll get from the Board of Supervisors, that 3%. We're asking for 4, but instead of just percentages, dollar amounts, what are we really talking about in terms of the delta?
Sure. When you look at the agenda item that was posted for tonight, it really lists expenditure highlights. So if you look at the proposed budget document, we actually present a chart that starts with our approved budget for this year, and it walks through every single expenditure increase and then every reduction to get to that net increase. So we do show every single line. In addition to the highlights, there are other adjustments, including things like contractual increases. There's a benefit rate increase for FCERS. There's some grant adjustments that are offset by revenue. But that chart will walk you through every single change from the current year budget to the proposed budget. When we look at the transfer increase and what we're requesting, from the revenue side, we're requesting a transfer increase from the county government of 3.99%. Right, that's just $14 million more than the budget guidance that they provided us. When you look at our overall revenue, the reason that transfer increase is higher is because we also have some shortfalls or some losses in other revenue categories, right? The largest of which would be our funding for beginning balance, our one-time funding. So that's really the difference between those two pieces.
Yeah, I recall it's not just the carryover is smaller, but also that the state and I believe there was a loss in state funding.
Correct. So when we look at state revenue, our proposed budget presentation does pick up all of the changes that were included in the governor's proposed budget, right? And we use that additional funding in the governor's budget that was higher than what we projected to reduce our transfer request from the county. But when you look at state revenue, there is a slight decrease in FY16 as compared to 15, and that's due to the timing of when the state adopted their budget for this current year, which was after our approved budget. So that's why you do see that reduction in that revenue slide in the presentation.
And I would just say that, again, because I found this very helpful, and as we talk about how we can better educate the public and those trying to understand why this massive school system, continues to have increasing costs. And we know why, but I think the more we can be clear in a very quick and easy way. So for those bullet points that I just noted, which I thought were all very substantive impacts to our budget, I would prefer to also see the VRS put there. I mean, I think when we're talking about big ticket changes, because it's my understanding that for FY16, our VRS contribution is also had to change.
There's no increase in our VRS contribution for FY16.
It's 17.
We are anticipating a large increase in FY17.
Okay, so that's where the hit is coming.
Next year.
Okay, all right. Well, I think in terms of what has been laid out here with the budget, I do want to echo what you heard tonight from the community, which is not only the ease of understanding the budget this year and previous years, but I think more importantly, the fact that you have helped us now deliberate on a budget that more closely aligns with what our county executive has said the fiscal forecast is for the county. And I think it really positions us well. So I want to thank you for that. And I'm very mindful from the questions my colleagues have raised so far, including what Ms. Strauss said with the Virginia court case on the B-poll tax that may be something that we're going to have to really revisit as we look down the road. But for now, I will say to my colleagues that I was very encouraged that our chairman of the Board of Supervisors, along with the county executive, apparently are sharing with the community that they are pleased with this proposed budget and really do feel that what has been laid out and what is being asked is very reasonable. And I, again, think that really helps us in this effort this year, how we really want to try and change the dynamic through that joint budget development effort and now this. And so I look forward to our work together and certainly next Thursday's vote.
Thank you. Mr. McElveen and then Mrs. Schultz.
Thank you. So as we know, last year the Board of Supervisors committed to fund our full-day Monday expansion. And with that, you know, we had the line item for 4.9 million, which includes 64 instructional positions, 63.8 positions. And I was wondering if we know or can delineate how many of those are going to specific areas. And the area I'm most concerned with, it's no surprise, would be our language area. Because I know we were hoping to expand some of those programs quickly, and not necessarily, we know we have to take time to develop the language through content curriculum as we phase out FLES, but I know we were hoping to get some started this year.
This current year, 9 schools implemented additional language programs as a result of full-day Mondays. And then as we plan for FY16, we are anticipating another 9 schools.
Okay, and do we forecast it's probably going to be at that level for the coming years as we implement?
I can take that. So I was just talking about this because we did have a 5-year plan, and we are below the rate that we would need to if we did 9 a year. I think we're at 66 plus the 9, and we anticipate that we'd need to be more like 15 in the following years. But we would be I feel like there's a lot of change with Mondays and schedules, and that we'd be able to scale that in the 5-year timeline.
I think part of our challenge also is providing the staff with the appropriate skills and licensure. So as we look at it down the road, and I don't know if any of you saw the Washington Post article where it compared our elementary world language programs to other surrounding jurisdictions. I think where we're challenged is how many varied languages we offer at the elementary level. That makes it much more difficult for our HR department to find folks. So I just think we have to look at it down the road. I think it's going to limit our ability to expand at the pace we like, but I think we definitely can get there.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And one thing I will add is that I am quite concerned with our ability to recruit in these areas. And it's not for a lack of there not being candidates in the market, because there are plenty of language teachers that the universities are churning out. We are just not going out recruiting them, helping them through gaining certification and things like that. So I think while we have a tight budget this year and the next year, I think that's someplace we need to look in terms of how we recruit, how we help with certification.
And I think we also need some help from the state. When they continue to add licensure requirements that create and exacerbate our challenges to recruit great teachers across the board, but this has been particularly so in our world languages at the elementary level. I think some of the licensure changes need to be reconsidered at the state level.
Okay, thank you. Next I have Mrs. Schultz.
I'm speaking before I was particularly ready, but I want to bring up a couple of things. I think that, Ms. Reed, you had asked if there were any next steps on the level 1 language, and although my colleague didn't have any, I'd like to offer a next step, and that is a greater understanding of the impact of level 1 to the system. I mean, we sort of have a dollar figure associated with it, but when we hear attributions that it's creating problems at the school level, and I know in particular talking to my high school principals, some of the issues that you all undertook going to Texas to look at other school models in terms of a welcoming school or some kind of alternate school program for rapid English acquisition, and what that could potentially actually save. It sounds like a new school model might cost more money, but I think in the end, that might be one of those things that you invest smartly now, you wind up saving money down the road. So, accelerating, any kind of target language acquisition for incoming students is one. And then we had on our table, and there's some things that we're allowed to talk about here and some things we're not, but, you know, I had a forum topic about requesting from the federal government assistance for unaccompanied minors that are in Fairfax County through the Office of Refugee Relocation. I'm going to renew that request, particularly in light of the B-poll issue, because while Ms. Strauss and, with all due deference, Ms. Michael, we didn't quite get to the impact. I think the impact is going to be significant, and unfortunately, I think it's going to wind up poisoning our budget work that was, you know, and Dr. Garza's budget efforts up front, in that even if the Board of Supervisors wants to give us what we want, that the Virginia Supreme Court decision in this case is going to, you know, strap them beyond, you know, their ability to help us. And so I think that my next step is I'm going to renew the request that we, in concert with legal, be able to request from the federal government some form of assistance to defray the additional level 1 expenses. So that's issue number 1. Number 2 is this B-poll thing is very, very significant. It's not only for this year, with an estimate of somewhere around a $30 to $50 million hit to the Board of Supervisors budget, and I think that we should seek, and I've asked for more information from the county attorney for us, an understanding of the way that's going to impact us, but in the out years. And so, you know, I don't want to cut our budget anymore whatsoever, but I also think that we're going to have to start to prepare ourselves for an eventuality that none of us, including the Board of Supervisors, saw coming. I have a question about the issue that was raised earlier in the evening with the bus drivers that spoke. It made it sound like the bus drivers have not been getting the same pay raise rate as other service personnel. Could you just talk about that? Because I'm confused in what I hear from the public versus what I thought my understanding was. Could you offer a little clarity on that, Dr. Garza?
We have not in past years, and as far as I've been able to look back, not given, when we've given a pay raise, we've provided that pay raise to everyone across the board. So whatever pay raise we put into place was put into place for all employees. Now, what the one particular individual was talking about was a delay in the step by 4 months. In order to be equitable, we had to delay everyone's by 4 months, not just some employees. Every employee's compensation was delayed by 4 months, and it's based upon the anniversary date of your hire to the system. So that 4 months is different, and this is for 12-month employees, not our teachers. So that when you got your step and when that was implemented was based upon when you were hired. And that's the only equitable way to have done that. I think we talked about that at length. So I think that was the point he was making, but we've given the same salary increases to all employees. And fortunately, I think that's the best approach. I'm hoping moving down the road that we keep it that way.
And something that I see, just because one happens to be parked out in my neck of the woods, are we having attrition rate issues, or attrition/retention/hiring issues because of bus drivers? I mean, I'm trying to figure out, is there something that's a unique problem here, or is this just, you know, we're, and Mr. Plattenberg or Dr. Garza?
Everywhere I've ever been, it was a challenge.
Okay.
In fact, we had to have campaigns to hire bus drivers. So it is very, very difficult everywhere I've ever been to recruit and retain bus drivers. So I know that Mr. Plattenberg may want to add to that.
You're absolutely correct, Dr. Garza. I mean, it's a challenge here. We've had those challenges in the past. That's one of the reasons why we do the advertisement we do. You'll notice that on a couple of key intersections, one up Braddock Road and the Fairfax County Parkway, we always have a bus parked up there saying that we're hiring and that we pay $18.14 an hour, and you get a CDL, commercial driver's license, through the process. But it is always a challenge.
You know, there is a tree stump in Fairfax Station that people used to decorate at different times of the year, because otherwise you'd forget about it. It was the ghost tree. And then it started getting decorated for all the different holidays. We may have to redraw attention to that bus. So we start, we'll put bunny ears on it and 4th of July, anyway, bunting. Another issue is the final budget that's there, the bullet item, 3.1 million for class size. I continue to be concerned about and am likely to offer an amendment, not in terms of cutting budget, but either placeholding money or moving money to another place. And if you have a particular concern, I share with Mr. McElveen the concern about elementary acquisition of foreign language, because for me, I know that the greatest success in graduating multilingual students and creating more opportunities for them in terms of employment, whether it's employment in the fine arts or employment in government service or abroad, regardless, is acquiring that language at a younger age. So the problem that persists is not, and I appreciate the notion that we're going to try to compress the highest class sizes below where the state tops them out.
Excuse me, Mrs. Schultz, could I ask you to defer the rest of that discussion until we get to that topic?
Okay. Well, I mean, so that's why I'm bringing it up, because that's a placeholder of 3.1 million, and I'm likely to push it up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're on to go-backs, unless there's anyone who hasn't spoken yet that would like to offer a question, comment, joke. A song, Mr. Velkoff.
Sorry, no jokes or songs. I did want to ask, the Fairfax Taxpayers Alliance made comments about retirement, and I'm just trying to get a grasp of, I don't think we have a lot of discretion about retirement. ERFC is entirely under our control, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct. The other piece is, remember, the Virginia retirement system implemented a hybrid plan for all new participants that joined after January 1, 2014, right? So the state has made substantial changes to retirement over the years in terms of addressing benefits and containing costs.
Right, but we don't have a choice about our employees paying into that system. We are required to have them participate in VRS. Am I right about that?
Correct. The state requires participation and sets the rates.
Okay, and then we have a few retirees that are in FSERS, or employees that are in FSERS, is that right?
We do. Our bus drivers, food service workers, custodian, and trades personnel participate in FCERS, which is the county's retirement plan.
The county's retirement plan. And again, we're not custodians of that plan, so we don't have the ability to affect the spending on retirement for employees in that category, right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have two quick go-backs, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Mr. Moon.
I just wanted to make sure that I was able to share with all of you that yesterday I did schedule a meeting with Chairman Bulova, since she used to represent Bragg District for 20 years, and I really respect her guidance. And I wanted to take an opportunity to talk with her about something that we've discussed at our work session and was brought up in the November forecast meeting. And it really had to do with fair and equitable compensation for all employees who work for the county. And so I just wanted you all to know that I felt it was a very good discussion. We talked about the history of county employees. At one time, teachers were treated separately, but all other FCPS employees that were administrative were actually under the county's payment system, and then it broke off. And then we talked about just how the last 10 years there's been a back and forth between which side was getting compensation increases. So I felt that in talking with her that she understood that even though we know from the school system side that our teachers are lagging in the market in terms of, competitive salaries in the marketplace within the region. And that is something that we, as a board and a school system, have to address. In my mind, there are almost two different issues we have to tackle. One is the annual raises that we look at. Any public employee in Fairfax County is looking at receiving to manage the cost of living increases that just come, especially living in this area. And separate and distinct is also the fact that if we are not having competitive salaries, then we also need to target that. But one is not necessarily tied to the other, because I am concerned at that macro level that, in fairness to our employees now, that when the county executive looks to set his budget and he looks at all total costs, if they're looking to increase payment for their employees, then they have to be doing the other side of the column calculations, which is giving that fair and equitable compensation to the school side. It can't just be a lump sum, we're going to give you 3% because that seems reasonable. It has to be, if they're doing something to increase costs on their side for employee compensation, that has to be transferred over to us too. So I know that in my mind, we're putting forward a reasonable budget. We're trying to mirror what, as best we understand what they're doing. But until the county executive comes back on February 17th, for us, the best we can go with is whatever projections they gave us to date. So,
Okay, thank you. Mr. Moon.
I want to go back to bus drivers just for briefly. That earlier today, we all received an email from a constituent about, with the concerns about bus drivers for the next year. So I turned it around and made it as a budget question and sent it to staff. But let me ask you this question, whether we will be, with the implementation of later high school start times, that we will be hiring more bus drivers next year. But do you also expect number of hours bus drivers in general will be working next year will be reduced?
I'll take that, Mr. Moody, if you don't mind. Honestly, it's a very good question. It's one we've been dealing with the Bus Driver Advisory Council, and one of the gentlemen who spoke this evening, in fact, is one of the members on the board there. It's a new initiative. We have looked and done our models, and we don't believe that we know exactly what the impact is going to be. We've never implemented this later high school start time, and we feel it's kind of premature for people to be stating that they're going to be losing money. I mean, there are pretty set standard contracts that we have, some 25-hour guarantees, but we did talk about that with the elimination of the false tier, there will be shorter runs. And I think through our communicating and our communication with some of our drivers, they viewed it as a loss of contract hours. We have committed all through this while with our bus drivers to assure them that if in fact somebody's hours are being reduced, we will provide them with opportunities of choice of runs, of choice of locations next to where they're parking, and also, if they're so inclined, to provide and pick up some of our field trip runs. So we're going to be working with our drivers as best we can to minimize any adverse impact such as that.
Thank you, Mr. Plettenberg. And again, I submitted there as a budget question, and I'm looking forward to receiving answers to that sometime, I guess, before we adopt the final budget in May. But having said that, realizing that, agreeing that it's always a challenge for us to hire and retain bus drivers, I would hate to see number of hours bus drivers will be working next year, being reduced, especially in light of the fact that now, in order to get a health benefits, the minimum number of hours you have to work has gone up to 30, and how that's going to impact the bus driver's ability to retain their health benefit. Am I wrong on that?
Sure. When we look at the change regarding the Affordable Care Act and needing to work 30 hours to be eligible for health benefits, that change doesn't impact employees that we consider in the category of what we call contracted hourly. So that will not impact bus drivers or food service workers, that change.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're
It doesn't affect the full service workers either. Thank you.
Correct.
Okay, before we leave this portion of the work session, could we just review next steps? There were a few suggested by Mrs. Schultz, and I want to try to determine whether or not you're suggesting specifics. For example, on the B-poll issue, is there a next step associated with requesting a briefing or?
There is. I'm requesting a briefing in closed session by the county attorney for us to understand the implication of the B-poll on the B-poll case on our budget.
Mrs. Street, I think we perhaps need to ask our own division counsel whether county attorney can advise us, give us a legal advice or legal briefing on something. I don't think.
Well, how about if the next step is to have staff assess who, but to provide some type of a briefing? I mean, that's the bottom line, is that the board wants some information on the B-poll issue as it relates to the budget, right?
And Kristen has already submitted a formal request to the county for much more detailed analysis and potential impact. So
Okay.
as soon as we receive that, that will be provided and posted as a budget question, I'm assuming.
Okay, very good. And also, Mrs. Schultz, assistance from the federal government on unaccompanied minors. Is that a particular action item?
Within the framework of the discussion that's already been had by this board, you know, I don't need to couch it any further than that, because the board's had discussion in closed session, but in concert with what we've received, I'd like us to pursue a formal request for assistance.
I believe, Ms. Schultz, you were suggesting that you might submit that as a forum topic. Is that what I understand, as a continued conversation? No?
No, I'm saying that the whole topic originated with the forum topic that we've already had, and then we've had a legal briefing on top of that, and then based on the information that's been provided to date, that in compilation, we take that and pursue additional federal funds.
Okay, I have some comments on that. So we'll try to get this issue resolved. I think it's questions regarding what was just posited there. So Ms. Hines and then Mrs. Smith.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to remember, but I feel like we resolved it in the conversation where we decided that we would, as part of our national legislative packet, advocacy packet, we would advocate for the federal government to fund assistance, yeah, for those. So I think we've already made the request as part of our legislative advocacy. If there's some other type of request you want to make, then, because I feel like we've already talked about that part.
Well, that was merely a position in our legislative package. So a position in our legislative package is not actionable by anybody. So that is merely saying that that's our legislative position, as opposed to going forward and making, in fact, a formal request and acting upon the words that we put in our legislative package.
I'm just a quick go back, because I am the federal legislative liaison. And you may still disagree with me, but I think that the action we take in response to that is that I go to our, which is actually this coming weekend, to the National School Boards Association Federal Advocacy Institute, and actually present that to our federal representatives as part of our advocacy. So there is an action item there, you know. So what more do you think we should do?
But that's going to the National School Board Association. That's not asking.
No,
they're not
going directly. We visit our legislators on Capitol Hill.
I understand, but there's still no ask. And the ask is from this county for the specific and direct impact as the second largest county and school division recipient of placement by DHHS's
Okay, I'm going
ORR.
to cut you up there. With all due respect, I think that we've got to stay focused on this discussion.
Well,
and I hear what you're saying about having a specific ask, and it's separate from this issue of the federal lobbying that's done. And so I think the place to address that would be, again, at forum. And we could have a lively and robust discussion there about whether the whole board wants to sign a letter, whether several members do. If you recall, that was an issue that came up with UVA one time, where we ended up, several of us wanted to sign a letter, some of us didn't. And so I think that that would be the best place to address that. I tend to agree with you, by the way, personally, but I don't think that this is the place to have that discussion right now, tonight, on the budget. So, as an action, could we refer that to forum with that specific ask in mind?
We can. We'll just go back full circle and start back at the beginning, and we're already here. So we've had the discussion around it, and now we know, and the reason and the impetus that I'm bringing it up now is because there is an inevitable and foreseeable impact to the budget discussion with the Board of Supervisors as a result of the Virginia Supreme Court decision in the B-Poll case. And so now, you know, there is further a further pressing reason to pursue additional sources of income to offset things like were brought up in the presentation this evening, including the level 1 issue.
Does anyone have any specific comment about this issue here? Ms. Smith and then Ms. McLaughlin.
I agree with Ms. Hines. This is an issue the board already dealt with. We brought it to a forum. We decided to move forward with making a decision. And I think if Ms. Schultz wants to bring it up again to the board in a forum, that's separate, and let her do that. But I feel like the board dealt with this issue and we should move on.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McLaughlin?
What I'm hearing is that with respect to the budget, and we talk about where we get our revenue. And we get our revenue from the federal government, we get revenue from the state, we get revenue from our local taxing authority and the Board of Supervisors. And so if I guess what I'd like is clarification from Ms. Schultz to see if I understood what she's saying correctly. Could we as a board say, yes, our initial statement in our legislative positions is that we believe that that the federal government holds some responsibility to the localities that have been affected by it. That's fine, that was the position. This is more about direct steps related to our FY16 budget. Do we as a board, whether it would be Ms. Schultz in the form of an amendment, say that and this is where I think I want the clarity, and maybe Dr. Garza can weigh in on this. Do we have an amendment to our own budget saying, here is our proposed budget, and this is our ask to the Board of Supervisors, but we also are having a dollar figure ask of, in our analysis of our level 1 language needs for FY16, we've seen a growth of X number of students needing to be served at this level, which translates to X number of dollars to fund those additional services, and we believe that the federal government has a responsibility to it. Is that, Ms. Schultz, where you're trying to go with this? Because
if you want to paraphrase it that way, that's fine. That works great for me.
Because what I'm saying is I do see how this relates to the budget. The question is there precedent? Is there another way to go around about doing this? And that goes back to the forum topic then. Well, I think Dr. Garza was going to say something, and then Mr. Moon looks like he wants to
Could I respond to that just briefly? I think Susan or Ms. Quinn or Ms. Michael could correct me if I'm wrong on this. As a part of budget motion, if there is any amendment to the budget, it's got to have a dollar figure. Income, revenue, and expenses figures. So if somebody wants to come up with a dollar figure for additional revenue from federal government out of this, so be it. If not, the only thing I can think of is doing it a follow-up motion after the budget is all done. It's like we give a guidance to the superintendent. We do something for ourselves to do certain things. But if not, either of those, you'll have to come up as a separate motion through a forum or work session or separate motion aside from the budget deliberation.
Great, and that was what I was trying to help with the competing perspectives among our colleagues was what Mr. Moon laid out, that if Ms. Schultz were to speak with our finance staff, and somehow through her conversations with Dr. Garza, she could actually develop a dollar amount based on whatever data would support it, then she could provide it to us as an amendment and/or a follow-on motion. But it would be because she's basically asking for a specific amount of funds. A dollar amount is attached saying we believe that this additional revenue needs to be paid to Fairfax County Public Schools.
Dr. Garza, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I was going to say what Mr. Moon said, that we would be unable to craft a motion that would then reflect a balanced budget as we, with regard to federal funding. To me, it's an advocacy issue. If we want federal funding to be changed or increased as a result of needs that we're experiencing, it's part of an advocacy effort, okay? And so I believe, as Ms. Hines pointed out, it is reflected. There was a lively discussion by this board about this with regard to the legislative agenda and advocacy agenda. And I think at this point, certainly we'd be happy to craft a letter on behalf of the board to get more specific. I think that's the direction we would have to go in terms of what Ms. Schultz said. And I'm not, I believe this isn't a real issue for us. And in fact, we put a dollar amount to it in the presentation that I did on the budget. So it is a definite need. I don't see that it would be in any way, shape, or form how we could amend the budget currently for that purpose, if that makes sense.
And you paraphrasing what she paraphrased is kind of brings back full circle in the form of a letter. So thank you, Dr. Garza.
Okay, good. So the next step then for staff or anyone who's attempting to follow this at home is that staff will take a stab at drafting a letter that will address the issue of the unaccompanied minors and the increase in level 1 ESOL services. And they will draft it, and then at that point we'll have the board decide. I guess we can just decide if we all want to sign it, if some members just want to sign it, similar to the precedent that was set with the UVA letter. Does that sound okay to people? Okay, Ms. Hines?
If what we're doing is basically writing a letter from this board reflecting the decision and position we've already taken, then I say we just draft it to say exactly what we've already agreed to, and then we don't need to agree to it again. We just send it to the relevant people.
Great.
Okay, can I have a sense of the board on that?
Great, that's where I started.
I don't know how we're going to get a dollar. I mean,
We can quantify the increased level 1, and so in terms of quantifying those increased costs, we could do that. I think that's the only thing we could tie to a dollar amount. But we can certainly intimate in a larger letter about those challenges.
Okay, thank you. Again, just sense of the board one more time. Does
Ms.
everybody?
Street,
Okay.
may I?
Oh my gosh, Mr. Moon, okay.
I think since that is a part of our legislative package, if the board wishes the letters to go out to the legislators, they can come from the school board chair as written our legislative package. If anything different from what's in there,
All right, let's have staff take a draft, and we'll go from there, okay? Because we really need to move on. And there may be further discussions that staff and the chair and vice chair want to have on behalf of the board.
Yes, prior to this
Chairman.
discussion, I'd already said because I saw Ms. Schultz advocacy, and I said, let's bring this to chair so we can talk about it further, and then we'll bring it back to the board. But right now, I understand. I've heard everybody's advocacy, and we'll bring it back.
Very good. Okay, let's move on then. And we're on item 2 of 4, just in case you needed a reminder. And it is now time to talk about the budget questions. Ms. Michael?
So all of the budget questions submitted by the board are posted. I just wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to tell both the board and the public that they're there. The only remaining questions that we have are, they weren't identified as being a priority in terms of the vote for next week. So we are still completing a question for the Board of Supervisors regarding some enrollment data and projections, as well as we have an outstanding question in terms of employee benefits. But all the other answers have been posted.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions about the responses to the budget questions? Mrs. Schultz?
I just have a quick question for Ms. Michael. Is there any reason, or is there anything in our process which would prohibit posting questions as they come in? Because what I can see, the benefit that I see is that if there are other people out in the community who are thinking about writing a budget question, supervisors, community members, citizen associations, whatever, then that would maybe stop, you know, receiving multiple versions. They would know the question's been asked and that an answer's forthcoming. Is there something in the way we do it that would allow that?
I think we could accommodate that request, so when the question comes in, we could post it and show it as unanswered, but that way you could see, and maybe we could even come up with a methodology where we just put something separate on the table of contents that says these questions have been asked but not yet answered.
Okay, so I mean, that just sounds reasonable, and then if there's other people in the community who are looking at that, then I can actually see it lessening staff work, because then they don't have to deal with the same question coming in over and over. They're like, oh, okay, the question's been asked, we'll wait for the answer. Thank you.
Very good. Anything else regarding budget questions? Okay, good. Moving on to item 3. I'll ask Dr. Pajardo to talk to us about the issue of the large class sizes at the elementary level. And Dr. Garza, I understand you want to tee up the issue for Dr. Pajardo.
If I may, yes, very, very quick. I'll try to be concise. I don't want to steal too much of Dr. Pajardo's thunder. But I know that our team and specifically Dr. Pajardo and her team have worked very, very hard on really taking a very deep analysis of the overall staffing process, which is very complex. And we won't touch on every component of that very detailed and complex timeline, but I just want you to be aware we've been listening. We've heard from our principals some of the challenges they experience in the staffing process. And we've heard from you, we've heard from parents that are concerned about class sizes in some parts of our community. And so some of the highlights that we're going to touch on tonight, I believe, are responsive to some of those key issues that were raised by various constituencies. I think some things that we were some goals that we were trying to accomplish in this work. Number one is to achieve greater clarity and to be more explicit about what our standards and expectations are around class size. You all know that we did some work on this last year. We just didn't get where we needed to in some cases. We also heard from our principals, they need to feel like they're more nimble in their ability to get out as early as possible and be in a position to hire as soon as possible. And so a lot of those changes were made. Dr. Pajardo has been engaging our various principal groups, and I'm hearing a lot of excitement around some of the changes that have been made as it relates to our classrooms. It also protects our very precious resource because we're very people intensive. These are precious resources that we're allocating out to schools. So some of the major process changes is a change to the timeline that accelerates the ability for principals to know how many open positions they have and have agreement there, to give priority schools a head start on the hiring process, which we think we've heard from principals is a challenge in the hard to staff schools. The ability to allow principals to begin hiring on May 1 versus June 1, that's big. Our principals are very excited about that. And next year, we'll keep watching this process, and we can tweak it and fine-tune it next year, but I think those are major improvements. Establishing a hard class cap is important, I believe. And then finally, among other many changes that were made, and I know Dr. Pajardo is going to talk about some of those, is we also would have a new policy change around after we start school. Within the first 10 days of school, we will pull teachers out of schools where they do not meet their number. So as Ms. Schultz and others can, talk about, oh, we have these small classes, some of that's a function of the fact that we've been reticent to pull teachers out of schools that did not meet their numbers. So These policy changes would address at the beginning of the process the ability for principals to hire more quickly and getting the best people out there, but at the other end, addressing that precious resource and making sure that we're not first going to staffing reserve, but we're using overstaffing in some schools to mitigate over-enrollment at other schools. And then finally, I'm just going to give some numbers. I'm almost finished, Dr. Pajardo. Just for some context, so you'll need to write these numbers down, is as of October 31st, we had 3,505 elementary classes. Okay, I'm not including kindergarten. There's a reason why, and Dr. Pajardo will talk about that. But in grades 1 through 6, 3,505 classrooms. Okay. Average class size is 23.5 across the board. We had 393 classes that were above this maximum cap that we're going to be talking about in just a minute. And then we had 70 that were below 17. Okay? And remember, we only fund classes at 17. So if they're below 17, we don't fund them at the division level. Okay? That was only 32 schools that had classes below 17. And keep in mind some things that affect that. Some of our immersion school programs where we're limited, and I don't have to tell you how that works. Some of our unique special education programming, and then we have just a handful of really small schools left where we've had to staff 2 teachers per grade level. But keep in mind the 70 below 17 is 0.02% of those overall classes. So a very small percentage of our classes throughout the system. And I think this would somewhat be mitigated by the fact that we would be, this coming year, removing teachers where we have not met the maximum size. So I think that's important to have some context around the conversation. So we believe that the resources that have been included in the budget will help us address some of these changes that Dr. Pajardo will be talking about. So it's all yours, Dr. Pajardo.
All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Garza, for those comments that help put things in perspective. A big part of what Dr. Garza said, even though I'm the person standing here at the podium, the work that I'm sharing with you this evening represents the work of a lot of thinkers. And while I am giving the message, all of us care about what happens in the classroom every day for students, because that is really why we're here, right, as well. So with that, I'm going to share a few comments. Then I'm going to go sit in the back here with my friends, and we will answer questions from there.
It's 2%. Okay, it's 2%. The 70 is 2%. I said that incorrectly.
I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to revisit that as well. All righty, so with that, let's talk about give you some context first regarding elementary class size. Certainly, as board members, you know that in recent years, there have been 3 times where we have increased class size. That is most recently last year, FY 2015, prior to that, FY 2010, as well as FY 2009 or 2009. This board and our superintendent are firmly committed to no longer increasing class size as part of our budget. You've said that individually, you've said that collectively, and now we're saying that for the public. We really are committed not to further increasing class size. So as part of this year's budget, $3.1 million has been set aside in recurring funds to, in fact, address large class sizes, specifically at the elementary level. As Dr. Garza said, as we have made these increases, it's not been taken lightly. We have tried to do some other things to mitigate that. You might remember that you added additional positions to the reserve specifically to address large class sizes, and we've used those positions accordingly as well. But we really are trying to look at something that is much more systemic and that we can put into policy and practice as well. So we're going to share some recommendations with you this evening. Please do know that the recommendations that I'm about to share will not impact the schools in the K-3 initiative, those schools are already capped at no the largest class size in a K-3 initiative is 24. And in some cases, 22 and 23 and numbers lower than 24. So with that, by state law, correct. So with that, the specific recommendations. And again, this is for elementary only. For kindergarten, we are actually recommending that there be no changes at the kindergarten level. Kindergarten is currently capped at 28 students, and for every class of 28 students at the kindergarten level, a teacher and an instructional assistant are assigned to those classes. So that would be no recommendations. Continue with 28 and 1 teacher and 1 instructional assistant in our elementary schools. We are recommending some changes at the 1st through 3rd grade level and the 4th through 6th. Let me first address 1st through 3rd. We are recommending for beginning next school year that 1st through 3rd grades are capped at 27. This would be inclusive of any classroom and any classroom core content for 1st through 3rd. So all of the instructional grouping in your core content areas. We are not recommending that change in terms of specials like PE and music, but certainly in our core content areas.
That includes also AAP classrooms, and so I wanted to point that out. And it includes our children who are designated as needing special education services.
Absolutely. We would also, as we look at that 27, we have some classrooms that we know, and this exists right now, that are a little bit larger than that. So if a classroom goes somewhere in the range of more than 27, so looking at 28, 29, 30 students, that we would look at allocating an instructional assistant for grades in 1 through 3 if a class reaches anywhere of 27, 28, 29, and 30. Let me give you an example of that in terms of for your consideration. So if you have 4 classes in 1st grade and you have a classroom that's at 24, 25, 26, and 27. That school has not reached any of our maximums just yet, right? Okay, so the next 2 students come in, it would be up to the principal working with families to determine what would be the classroom that student or those 2 students or 3 students go in. We will be certainly recommending and working with our principals to ensure that those smaller classrooms, the classroom with 24, 25, have additional capacity. They're not at 27 yet. So we will be looking for those placements of the new students into those smaller classrooms. However, when, in this example, all of the classrooms began to exceed 27, the next student comes in and someone is going to have 28 kids because now the first classroom that had 24 now has 27. The classroom that had 25 now has 27. The classroom that has 26 now has 27. And the other classroom already had 27. So when the next student comes in, it's going to be the 28th student, and that student would be exceeding our maximum. We would then be allocating an instructional assistant to assist. Not a teacher just yet, but instructional assistant. So an instructional assistant would be allocated when classes in 1 through 3 would be at 28, 29, 30. When the classrooms would reach consistently above 30, going to 31, we would then allocate a teacher. And then our expectation is that all of the other classes are rebalanced to go below the 27.
The reason this part is important, because this changes all year long. we can staff, as Dr. Bajardo pointed out earlier, we can staff easily keeping it under this number at the start of the school year, but it doesn't stay that way. So we have to have some wiggle room because we know that after a certain time, parents are not particularly excited about the fact that their child's class is now going to be balanced. So we think this is kind of a good little bit of wiggle room that would not require a lot of disruption for elementary students, but recognizes that when you get above our maximum number, you need additional support in the classroom. So we're acknowledging up front that once at any point in time when we get above that number during a school year, we're going to provide additional support from the staffing reserve into that classroom without having to change configuration of classes. Now, I will also tell you, this comes also with a requirement that we provide notice to all the parents of students in the class that gets above the number, and indicate that we're going to provide sample letters to our principals. This will be part of our regulation that the principal is required to notify parents, and to also communicate what we're doing to support the classroom, so that they're well aware that their child's class has gotten above the maximum number, and that we've allocated a highly qualified instructional assistant to assist the teacher.
So we're doing some differentiated staffing so that, in terms of the instructional assistant in certain size classes, and then a reallocation of a teacher going above at 31 or above for first through third. For 4 through 6, we are recommending beginning next year that 4 through 6 be capped at 30. I'll just let you sit with that for just a little bit. Again, it's in the instructional groupings as we described previously when we were sharing about first through third. The range for an allocated instructional assistant at grades 4 through 6 would be 31 to 35 students. So a 4 through 6th grade classroom could have that range of students, and then an instructional assistant would be allocated to provide support. When 4 through 6th grade classes reach 36, a teacher would be assigned, and then it would be expected that classes would be balanced to go below the cap. I'm sure as you look at the number 35, you probably think, oh my gosh, that seems like a large number. Please know already that is what our staffing is. We do allow classes to go up to 35, and actually with our standards of quality, we are allowed to go up to classes of 35 at the elementary level. A few other enhancements that Dr. Garza began to speak with you about that are in development. And I'm saying in development because this is a continuous improvement process right now. We know that it's important as we look at our critical fields such as ESOL, all levels of special education, reading, higher level math and sciences, that we need to have a laser focus on qualified candidates to meet the needs of our students. So this year, our job fairs and our early hire offers will be concentrated on filling critical needs. And we've already identified 2 job fairs, so again, we'll be looking for those teachers and teachers that want to come to Fairfax in those critical needs areas.
One of those is world languages, as was
Yes,
pointed
thank
out
you.
earlier. One of those it's math and secondary math and science,
Correct.
special education, ESOL, and world languages. Did I miss anything? I think those are.
Special ed is a biggie.
Special ed is a biggie, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Garza mentioned that we also want to give special staffing consideration to our priority schools. We want to give them access to early hires first from the get-go, because we know that the quality of teacher quality impacts student achievement. We also would be giving priority consideration where the priority schools will not, we will not place D staffs into those schools in core content areas. Okay, so again, protecting the classroom and having those schools really be able to focus on making the success that they need to. Then we really are compressing the staffing calendar. It is going to take all of our departments working together, from projections right away to getting to an early May hiring for our principals and for our schools. Normally, we would open up our open process. Actually, Dr. Garza said June 1, but we actually typically have not opened up hiring outside until late June. I'm talking the end of June. So having this process start 6-8 weeks almost in advance is going to be a great thing for us to bring in new candidates, to get them acclimated to Fairfax County schools and to the schools with whom they'll be working. And so with that, we will take comments and questions, and I will move to the other. Dr. Garza, did you want to say
Yes, I
anything?
would just say one more thing. This is the first time we've ever, in any regulation, had a hard and fast cap, and that we've modified staffing in response to what our principals have indicated are true challenges for them, what parents are concerned about. So I'm not saying it's a work completed yet. I think next year we'll have to monitor how these new regulations work for us, and I'm confident we'll have to tweak next year at some point. I'd love to be in a position to even lower these numbers if we could, but I'm reticent to do that until we know the full impact. So I think this is a starting point. And I think it certainly will help in a lot of areas where we've had those challenges, not being across the board, but in certain areas. And so I appreciate your work, Dr. Pajardo. Anxious to hear the questions and comments from board members.
Okay. Lots of hands going up here. Thank you, Dr. Pajardo. We'll start with Ms. Evans, followed by Mr. Moon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the conversation and the explanation of where we're going with this. Dr. Garza, of the 393 classes that you mentioned, are all of those classes, do they all meet the criteria, or are those simply classes that are above the cap? So in other words, I'm trying to figure out how many this would apply to, because the principals have to even out the numbers, correct?
Well, it gets complicated because, in fact, these are numbers where we haven't had a standard where we said, principals, you have to keep the classes under this number. So when you look at class sizes at any one grade level, Dr. Pajardo, I think, gave a good example. You may have had classes that were, in some cases, at the same grade level, pretty low, and then one that ended up being kind of high.
Yes, I'm looking at
and so
them
some of
now.
it's kind of it's not maybe indicative of how many actual classes are it's
Would
not,
meet
it
your
assumes,
criteria.
Right, and it assumes all the rest of them are really close or right at it, and that's not the case.
Okay.
I
I think that answers my question, and maybe a better way for me to ask it would be if you have analyzed, if you look at, for example, you send us class sizes back as of October 31st of 2014, and I've been scanning that. In our current situation, how many new teachers would you anticipate? I mean, how many schools would get a new teacher? How many schools would get a new IA from this? Have you analyzed that?
It's hard to project. We think
Okay.
the current amount of money, along with our staffing reserve that we have, we think that we'll be able to, without too much challenge, make this work. It's so complex. We've allowed some trading in of positions that
That was going to be one
we
of my
would
questions.
we would have to stop doing some of that.
Okay.
And for some of our schools, this won't change their world at all.
Okay.
But there are some schools that will get additional staffing as a result. And I was interested to learn as we continue to study it. It's interesting because we have some schools that we have a higher number of those classes over that number. So I think it's some choices around some structure and master schedule and just configuration that the principal has chosen to employ. And it's hard for us to continue to have that much flexibility and keep our school community around us. So in some cases, I don't think it's necessarily a function of they did not have the resource under our current configuration to
Right.
fund it. So it's going to be really working with our principals. And we've come up with a model for training assuming that we can, we're going to be able to move forward with the budget the way it is, but that we'll be training our principals, really looking at their master schedules. We recognize we have a lot of new elementary principals. And it's really looking at by region, really holding their hand and making sure that we're staffing appropriately. So
And that's what I'm
we
trying
believe
to-
we're going to have enough resource to get it done.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get a handle on, because I'm looking at some of these class sizes and seeing that there can be both very low class sizes within the same grade and very high ones, and a lot of them are the AAP classes that are very high numbers, and then the non-AAP very low. So under this plan, principals would have to even those out somehow before they got an extra staff person? Or no?
No, AAP is also included.
No, I
So-
understand that, but I'm looking at some schools where you got 31, 31, 31 in AAP classes and 22, 23, 24 in non-AAP in the same grade level at the same school. So would we be giving that school more resources because their AAP were at 31, but their non-AAP were still very low?
I would say in most cases that would be true, but we would have to go out. We're just not just unilaterally going to say, okay, here's some more staff. We have to go out and make sure that they're maximizing their current resource.
Okay.
And if we're convinced they are, then we would, in that case, add additional staffing.
So you're going to have some flexibility
Did you want to
here
add to that?
in that, because, my concern is if you have somebody who has made a decision to keep certain classes very low and others very high, I'm reluctant to add a staff person at that school.
We are too.
Okay.
We would
And
be
then-
too.
And then another question in regards to that, I'm seeing some where there's very high grades that say fifth grade is very high classes, but the fourth grades are very low. Would you expect a principal to even that out with a combined class, or would you not? Or is that something to be determined?
So I would certainly say we need to have a mantra that combinations are not a bad thing. It's okay to have a combination class. Also, some of the decisions around the configurations are in fact just what you said. We do staff a formula 26.75. So we know that any classes that are running greatly above that would mean that there are classes somewhere in that school that are greatly below that as well. So this would be a closer monitoring of those configurations, as well as having folks explore practices that perhaps they have not explored in the past. It might mean combination classes or multi-age classes, flexible grouping more than a school currently uses as well. So,
But that would not have to be our go-to, because we should have a sufficient staffing. In some cases, this is driven by some choices that are being made at the
Right.
campus level.
Right.
So, it's very nuanced. I'm not a person that goes directly to combination classes as the first thing, because we need experienced teachers to know how to do that well. But when we have circumstances where the teacher's adept at doing that, it can be great for kids. So I don't want to exclude it as a possibility, because I think it can be, great experience for our students. But it is just kind of one of our kind of tools in our toolbox.
Okay, and two more questions, and then I'll turn it over to someone else. The priority schools that are going to get kind of a head start here, when you say that, do you mean the official priority schools, or are you using that as a generic term to mean any high-needs school? Are you saying specifically the 29 PSI schools?
Yes, and we're actually working on some new methodology identifying tiered schools.
Okay.
So 15 of the most neediest schools we have in terms of academic performance, then a second tier of schools. And so we're talking about all of those would be similar to what our priority schools have been in the past.
Oh.
We're working through that right now.
To get a definition?
Yes, and we're actually going to be able to say specifically up front, how do you become a priority or targeted school?
All right.
So
Good.
those would be put up front in the staffing process. So when the staffing, we have the staffing meetings with Dr. Bajardo, the principal comes, and different people show up and they walk through staffing. All of the priority schools will be front. They would be the first ones scheduled. And once their staffing meeting is completed, they can go out and start hiring.
That's great. I'm delighted to hear that we're going to have
We heard
some
time and time
others.
again from certain principals that if they're struggling, struggling school, they have a difficult time staffing. And so that's why we felt like that was very, very important and certainly core to their improvement.
And my last question is, you mentioned the small number of schools that are below 17, but you're not recommending a floor in this? Okay.
No, we just think we need to keep it where we think our current floor of 17 is appropriate. If it were moved up higher, our schools would lose staff.
Okay.
We believe that what will help us, though, with that said, is really monitoring very closely throughout the process. There are numbers, and there's some other procedures that we're going to be putting in place during the summer to ensure that our numbers are correct all throughout the summer. But that when we put in this regulation that in the first 10 days of school, if you're not meeting your numbers, we're pulling staffing out, that will help us mitigate some of that, we think, in a way that's appropriate.
Thank you.
Next, I have Mr. Moon, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Yeah, some of the questions that I wanted to ask have been already asked by Ms. Evans, so I'm not going to repeat those. But just for clarification purposes, the flexibility and discretion currently given to our building principals in terms of staffing, class size, you get certain number of teachers for your school, and you look at the students, number of students in each grade level, and principal has a lot of discretion to come up with the size of classes. And I think you said that you will be closely monitoring how the principals may exercise those flexibility, and I wonder whether this proposal is going to greatly impact on principals exercising those flexibility. That's a pretty open question at this point. You'll have to closely monitor and see how they exercise. You'll be working with the principals when they come to you to ask for additional staffing to deal with the large class size. That is one. Second is, going back to combination classes. A lot of times combination classes happen because there is imbalance in the number of students per grade level. And since the number of teachers you get is basically driven by the formula, and hands of the principals are basically tied as to the number of teachers you get, and that forces you to have a lot of times combination classes. But with this proposal, do I assume that there will not be any more forced combination classes?
Okay, well, I'll try the first one, the last one first in terms of the combination class. So, this is dynamic in terms of what we are proposing. We don't expect major shifts in projections in schools. However, that does occur in some schools. We can see schools that, change enrollment, 75 students, 100 students, et cetera. And then we would have to be looking very closely at what would make the most sense in those schools. I think in terms of principals' flexibility, we certainly are giving more defined responsibility. Some of the flexibility will need to be managed, and a big part of that is talking with principals about this now, so they can start getting their head around this now and kind of giving some scenarios, what if, and so that they're thinking about this in February before students are actually back in September. And the more we can do that, the better.
I think there's some trade-offs in this because I will tell you that there's at least the perception, I don't agree with this, but there's at least the perception that allocation or resources coming from the staffing reserve was about how you massaged or managed the politics. So I think to some extent by saying this is our standard and this is what we're going to be staffing to helps mitigate some of that perception that staffing reserve is only allocated if you I don't know, got your parents upset or got a board member upset or whatever. So I think having more clarity around what our expectation is and how we're going to staff, I think helps. I know that Dr. Pajardo also has been engaging a lot of our principal groups, including elementary, middle school, and high school. Would you speak to the response? Because I think that would speak, Mr. Moon, to how they feel about, because it does, for a few, may limit, there were principals that put, 35 or more, 37 kids in a math class maybe, and had 15 in another math class. Would they be able to do that after this point? No. But do we think that that's appropriate to have more than 35 children in a classroom in any configuration? So would you speak to what principals' reactions have been, Dr. Pajardo?
Certainly, the reactions have been widely very supportive. I have asked principals, and Dr. Garza uses the term to suspend judgment. I have asked each group, as we have talked about this, to be curious before being critical. Be curious about, ask questions about what does this mean? What could this be? What could be the possibilities before going to, the side of, boy, this is really going to hamper my flexibility. I'm not going to be able to do X, Y. But what would you be able to do? They are certainly, I think, folks for the most part, when they know the information right up front, as Dr. Garza said, the clarity, it gives them the responsibility to know and to respond, as well as they are very, very thrilled at the opportunity to hire folks much earlier. And they know that, again, that teacher quality is going to impact the success of their school.
And keep in mind, it's almost $4 million more staff in schools where it's needed.
Just one more. I'm happy to see these proposals. Anything we do to alleviate the overcrowding situation in any classroom will be helpful. But at the same time, just like Dr. Pazara will be doing, I'll be closely monitoring this myself. If he could provide the board with a progress or an update on how we implement this, how this impacts our classrooms, I'll appreciate the next year. Having said that, one big question that I have is this: whether that $3.1 million we are putting in to address large class size is not going to be sufficient to actually implement this model.
Sure. So we don't have our final projections for next year yet. So what we did is to estimate the costs, we looked at all the current configurations of class size. And we do think between the funding available in FY16 and the positions that remain in the reserve specifically to address class size, that we will be able to implement this successfully.
So it is not just a $3.1 million. All the resources that we have for staffing reserve will be used to address this together.
Yes, and in fact, also we have a one-time, you all approved for one time, just next year, an additional $800,000 out of one-time money. So it equates next year, just one time, 1 year, almost $4 million, plus the other, staffing allocations we have to call upon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Mrs. McLaughlin followed by Mr. McElveen.
The more questions I hear my colleagues ask, the more it raises additional questions and unfortunately some concerns. The first thing I just wanted to share in reaction to sort of a positive presentation that Dr. Pajardo was saying, but I want to give you a counterpoint as someone who still has children in the public schools and has seen the change in the last 14 years. Since my oldest enrolled as a kindergartner. This school system, as we know through the data, has changed in the last 14 years. It's changed in the last 40 years since my husband enrolled as a kindergartner. And the concept of combination classes, my sister had it back in the 70s. My middle son, who's a high school senior, had a 1-2 combo. And I got to tell you, this notion that it's a good thing, it's not necessarily always a good thing. It was not a good experience for my son, and he's a highly capable kid. But he will tell you that he didn't feel he had a relationship with the teacher. He had a relationship with the IA. that it was hard to have a relationship with second graders when he was a first grader, and he had a second grade brother, and he knew all those kids. So it isn't always wonderful. But my bigger concern is in the academic diversity that we know we have in the school system. This is a school system with children coming and arriving with all different levels of preparation. And when you talk to the teachers about how you deliver instruction now, especially at the elementary school level, and they do differentiated instruction, it can sometimes be, at minimum, 2 lessons of differentiation per core subject area in a single grade level class. Now you make that a combo class, that teacher could have, at minimum, 8 differentiated lessons for language arts, math, social studies, and science. And so when I've talked to some of the elementary school teachers, they will say, with the elementary school report card, with all the other things that have changed in teacher workload, I have very real concerns about combination classes. And I do hope that we're very mindful of the fact that 40 years ago, 20 years ago, versus even 14, where we are now, we have to be very careful, I think, about what a combination class means for that teacher and for all of those students in there. Because even a single grade level class now, kids will tell you which kids can ace that SOL prep in the first day and have to wait 5 days worth of SOL drilling so that everybody else gets to where they need to be. And it's very real. I'm not just, taking a one-off. It's what we're contending with. So I guess my first ask would be that I deeply appreciate the commitment of Superintendent Garza, my colleagues who have spoken passionately about this issue. I know we all see it in our districts. So I'm excited about this step. But I would ask that this presentation, I think it needs additional information in there. I think for the board members as well as the public, we need to add in slides about the combination class and the overall formulas for how this gets done. Because I remember my principal saying, I'm sorry, you're going to have a combination class even though the 4th grade has 22 kids in it each and the 6th grade has 30 kids each. But the way my 1-2 grades work, I got to do a combo class. And so they, in other words, kids don't come in half sizes. So I think when we look at this, and we have to understand and wrestle with it, right now, if I presented this, I think families would be more hopeful saying, oh, this is great, we just hit that magic number. But what I heard tonight was, no, we still have a staffing formula of X number of children in the building means X number of teachers are going to be, assigned there. And then how they break up per grade level means whether or not you have a single grade, you've got a combo grade, or whether you're going to end up with an IA, and then will you end up with finally, broken up classes to have smaller class size. So
Let me first reiterate, as I stated earlier, I don't think it should be our go-to. I'm fearful of us saying we're not ever going to do it. I think we need to monitor it next year because I'm not sure what the cost would be if we say it's never going to happen. I think certain circumstances with certain skilled teachers, I think it still can be, but it certainly should never be our go-to. But I want to manage expectations of our community too. We're taking some big leaps here. I think it's just the first step. I think down the road we'll be in a position once we experience this. Watch how it costs, and if we're able to tighten it up even further next year, I'll be all for that. At some point, if we can say never a combination class, and oh, by the way, we're going to take it down to 27 at grades 3 through 6, I mean, I'd be thrilled, but I think this is a good starting point. And then finally, with regard to what would be communicated to the public, we're crafting right now a regulation. That's being worked on right now. It's just not quite ready yet. So at some point in the near future, there would be a regulation that would be available to the public that our principals or school leaders would have to follow. And so when people, so would the public know? Yes, it would be available as a regulation.
Well, that's probably the most important clarification you could make for me tonight was the way I started to hear it was combination classes was a middle step in there, not well, the ideal is you've got a single, classroom teacher And then if we start to get toward the tipping point, we get an IA, then we have to just split the class up and add an extra teacher to the grade level. But there will be times, and it's something that the system will have to work on, that combination classes could still develop. My worry would be is we talk about standardization across the system, which principals say, look, I'm going to do everything I can, that we're just going to avoid combination classes. And then another principal says, I like my flexibility and trading my positions to do here and there, and I'm just going to use more combination classes than other
Okay,
schools.
Ms. McLaughlin, I think we understand the point that you're making there. Do you have other issues that you want to raise?
Ms. Reed, I appreciate that. I guess what I'm saying is because the presentation didn't say anything about combination classes, our colleagues brought it up, we're now hearing information about it. I just think it's helpful getting this clarification from Dr. Garza. So it doesn't all have to be answered tonight, but I do think that if we're talking about next steps from this evening, I do think as you're working through this, Dr. Garza, and thank you again, because really the good news is we're talking about September. So anything we iron out between now and September is good.
And we can report out to the board next year how we're doing with this, how many combination classes we've had to, because the challenge is the kids don't come to us in these logical groupings. And that's why it's hard for us to say hard and fast there would never ever be, but I would be thrilled if we have many fewer next year than we've had in previous years. And I think we do need to closely monitor, and we're happy to report out so you all know kind of what is the status and where is this investment of additional dollars gone and what kind of impact it's had.
So for Ms. Reed, that would be my next step request. I know Mr. Moon said monitoring this. I think if we could have a follow-up when it's reasonable for you, Dr. Garza, tell us how many combination classes do we have right now for FY15, and that will give us a starting point of understanding what we're looking at through the system. So thank you.
Very good. Okay, next, Mr. McElveen, followed by Mrs. Strauss and Mrs. Schultz.
Thank you. So first of all, I truly want to praise the decision to begin hiring earlier, because as someone who has just come through with my peers in this age cohort, I've seen many of them receive offers from Prince William and Loudoun, and have to sit on those for a couple months until they can hear back from Fairfax. And I think that's going to greatly benefit us to help us get that first chance to get these graduates out of college. So I'm very happy about that. When it comes to the idea of combination classes, I spent 4 grades in elementary school in combination classes, and it was not so bad. But it shouldn't, as Dr. Garza says, it shouldn't be our go-to. But is in a time of diminished resources, we have to do what we have to do. And then finally, on the I do have some questions about the scenario that we talked about when all classes reach that plateau at 27 and the next one tips into 28. My concern is that adding an IA to one class is not particularly efficient when it's just going to be addressing that one group of students. I think it would potentially, if you have those 4 classes, be more efficient to hire a teacher that can be spread out across those students. And it's hard to describe mathematically, but in thinking about it in my head, that does present a concern, and I don't know how that could be addressed. But when you consider that an IA is about $20,000, depending where they are on the scale, and a teacher is 60. If you divide it over 4 classes, a teacher would be more efficient.
Well, and I think the piece about the IA, in terms of, I was just talking to a group of folks yesterday, and we're talking about the IA and the use of an instructional assistant, and it would certainly be able to be used across different grade levels, across that grade level to support good instruction, because most likely that's a school that's reconfiguring for other things as well, and so it's an additional resource that could support that classroom as well as the students in the students at that grade level in a different class.
I totally get the point. The challenge I think we have is recognizing, having been a former elementary principal, is I will tell you, it's very difficult to call parents and say, hey, I need to create another class. And that teacher you've already fallen in love with, that's no longer your teacher. So we really weren't trying to say, let's reduce our costs by adding an instructional assistant. But what we were trying to do is, we recognize classes are going to get above that. Before we just add a teacher and then split everybody and create disruption, recognizing that we have put more on that teacher, providing additional resources with a highly qualified instructional assistant. So it wasn't trying to reduce, not giving them a teacher, it was recognizing that, if you're one or two above, it may not be worth the disruption to lots of families and children. But at some point, it does, require us adding a teacher and maybe contemplating kind of a reshuffling. So we're going to have to really work through this very carefully this next year.
I appreciate that explanation.
It's difficult.
Thanks.
Mrs. Strauss.
Okay, returning to sort of the picturing of the second grade where all three are at 27. When one gets to 28, then the school gets an IA. Then what happens when the second class gets to 28? Do they get an IA? When the third gets to 28, do they get an IA, or is that when the whole school gets a teacher?
We have flexibility there. That's where we sit down with the principal. According to our regulation, yes, they would all get instructional assistants, but they may very well choose to say, you know what, let's go ahead and create another section. I have a good relationship with my school community. Let me add another section, and I'll at the right time, I'll balance these classes and I'll work with my parents and make that work.
Right, because technically if you have...
So I think we have some flexibility either way. It's just knowing what the school community would support.
Because if you have two IAs, you could basically trade in those two positions and get a teacher if that's what, but then if you've got the two IAs working in your school, you don't want to let them go. And then I guess the question is, I would hope that we wouldn't be envisioning having all three of those classes get to 30 with IAs before they would get another teacher. Because then we would actually be seeing an awful lot of classes getting bigger than what they are now.
I've seen both happen in other school systems, where we ask the principal, would you prefer another teacher, or would you prefer not having to balance the classes and have, if they, like for example, if you said second grade, right? If I'm a principal and all of my second grade teachers are master teachers,
then
I may choose to keep, hey, let them go to 30 and let's add a highly qualified instructional assistant, each one of them, because I know these are master teachers. So I think a lot of factors are going to have to go into, how we manage that.
Right. My question is, I wouldn't want to see us become rigid to say we won't release another teacher unless all of your grade sections have reached that absolute cap plus an IA, because then you really are driving towards, because I was going to say the other scenario that happens in every school is that across the grade level you may have in any given year some number of children who have huge needs, and that may or may not be IEP driven, and then you're balancing out what classes you put the kids in with what the teachers can handle. So you may have, let's say again in a second grade, you may have one class at, let's say 27, maybe you put two at 27, and then you leave one at 22, partly because you have some very needy children. But that's also something that goes on. And
I think your point's a very good one, and I think we'll need to make sure that the language is clear about that. It wasn't our intent to say we don't want to give you an additional teacher until you get to the maximum.
Okay,
it was recognizing that if you get one over, it may not make perfect sense.
Right.
And because that happens all the time. You're just one over.
Right. And I know from the community standpoint, parents
so I think
will always
make
say,
that clear.
Right. Parents will usually say, well, this particular class is at the cap. That means we must be able to get another teacher. And then the question, that's often where there's not an understanding that, well, if we do this, we will reorganize your entire grade level. And then often they will say, well, we didn't really mean that. So there will still be flexibility in how this is managed. Yes.
We have to have some flexibility because it's kind of to your point or your example, it is so different in every classroom, in every grade level, in every
and it's
school.
different every year,
And different from one week to the other. I mean, there's just so many moving parts, and so we just have to have confidence in our principals' understanding. We now have, articulated clear expectation.
Right.
We're going to help them, and then we're going to, use this. We're going to use good judgment in working with our principals. But at the same time, I think we've taken on the fact that we've got to better communicate with our parents too, with some of these decisions.
Right, and then the other part of that question is, again, always the struggle when we get to the August staffing. And a principal say, I'm expecting 2 or 3 more kids, they're in the pipeline, the parents have come through, the paperwork isn't done yet, but no, I don't have everything signed and sealed. Or the assumption that traditionally we've always gotten a few more kids the first week of school, or, it's always that issue, if we're close to the bubble, can't you give us one more teacher? And that's always, parents become very concerned at that August staffing.
Well, I will tell you this, knowing up front that within the first 10 instructional days, if they don't meet their number, that we're going to pull resource, I think we're both willing to say, if you really do think you're going to get that many, we'll staff you, but remember that if you don't meet your number, we may need that, we're going to pull that teacher and put them somewhere else where we need them.
Okay, so,
So
that helps everybody to understand, if you're going to take that risk, this is the risk that you will take.
That's correct.
And if they don't come, we're going to pull it back. And then the other piece is in the fact that we have hired this very young 2 consultants to help us get a better handle on enrollment projections over the summer and real estate and what have you. Are we going to benefit from any of that? Because that's the other unknown.
A couple other things that because this gets complicated and we weren't intending to go through every little nuanced step in this process, so I'll try to make this quick, I'm sorry. But we have allocated additional staffing to our schools so they can have their, their office, clerical, what's the position
Right,
title?
so the student information assistant.
Yes.
Okay.
Throughout the summer, at least 1 day a week.
Okay, so
Okay.
that we will be able to register quickly in those cases.
And there
where
will be a stated expectation in this new regulation that we expect records, students withdrawing or entering the system, to be kept up to date. Once a record happens, it must be updated within the week.
Okay.
So that we can monitor, because what's happened in the past is those records just are sitting somewhere, never inputted into the system until we come back to school.
Right.
Until someone gets to it, and it's a stack, and it takes a long time for people to get, and so our numbers are never accurate until just right before school starts. And so we've changed that process too.
Right.
So there's other steps in the process that we've changed to help us have a better reflection of numbers all throughout the spring, summer, and into that August staffing into the start of school.
Right. And let me share with you one other piece that needs explanation. In some schools, some principals will choose to tell parents in May or June who their teacher is going to be or what their class is going to be before they are really sure in September. I know, and I always get a little nervous about thinking, really, you want to do this? But I guess then the issue would be, again, for them to clearly understand this 10-day rule, that it may not be what you think. Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good. I have Mrs. Schultz, followed by Mrs. Smith, Ms. Hines, Mr. Stork, and we still have one more agenda topic, so Ms. Schultz.
Well, I'm going to give my colleague, Ms. Strauss, a chance to walk back her comment on the really young consultants, which took my breath away, because I know she's not ageist, right?
No, but
because I know if they were not really young, but maybe the opposite, she really would want.
They look like my own children, and to
I
me,
know.
they're
I'm just
young and
saying.
handsome and brilliant.
We are being age sensitive, so you got to keep it a little bit light. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the conversation. Not that I'm not ignoring you, I'll get to you. But Dr. Garza, when you gave us the initial overview, you said 70 classes below 17. Can you describe for us what you mean by that? Because we have a lot more than 70 classes under 17. It's just what we fund at the central level. I'm assuming what you mean.
No, this has nothing to do with funding. This is actual class sizes as of October the 31st.
Okay, we'll have that.
Correct? Someone,
We'll have that conversation offline, because at 1,026 classrooms at 20 and under, it wasn't just 70 classrooms at 17 and under. Not, I mean, or under 17. So I'll continue, I mean, we have a scheduled meeting that got waylaid because of weather and things this week.
And maybe this confusion is the number we're citing is in grades 1 through 6. So I'm not sure if you were just looking at grades 1 through 6.
And not special ed.
It's non-special ed. Okay, so we'll continue that conversation. With regard to the issue of the blended classes, and I've been relatively lucky. My children have only been, and actually I'm not sure that my children actually have even been in one, but I've been in a school where there's been one, of all the classrooms, one blended class. But really, the issue that I'm hearing is the question of the board's regulations and policies around 2 tracks, and that when we get to a class size that would otherwise meet even your suppressed caps, but there's only one of them, then we're splitting, because we don't want a teacher to teach, you know, without a peer class. And so I'm wondering if we've been able to quantify that degree of a problem, because then it's a question of, you know, do we hire a second teacher to have, quote unquote, a second classroom of an elementary grade, so that that teacher will have a peer to do, you know, professional development and collaborative teamwork and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Is that really the best use of dollars? Or could we maybe, instead of funding a whole other, you know, body at a full-time equivalent and having a second classroom, if there's only going to be 25 or 26 kids in the classroom, could we not give her or him, he or she, give that teacher additional, you know, professional development time or additional resources to maybe collaborate across other schools in the pyramid that would aid in that professional development, rather than having 2 suppressed class sizes?
when I talked about 70 classes below 17, not all of those are a function of the fact that we're adding, that we have, as a practice, staff 2 teachers per every grade level, okay? That's a function of a lot of things. As we address some of our capacity challenges, we're going to automatically take care of that, looking at our small schools and addressing how do we increase capacity at our small schools, something Mr. Stork, we've talked about some in your area. I think that's a way to address some of that. The challenge we get in these small schools is sometimes it's just hard to make the math work. And oftentimes, even if we say we're going to put 2 teachers per grade level, you actually don't have few enough to have 1. So, you know, it's a lot easier to make it work when you have 4 or 5 or 6, 7 teachers per grade level. It just, the math is very hard to make work. But,
Okay,
I mean, it's a policy.
So quantifying it, the issue of coming up with 2 tracks and having a peer teacher is not really, that's not really the issue.
I don't think it is. As I look at this, there's 1 or 2 schools
Okay,
that
so
I know it's because they're a small school. I don't know if you want me to say them out loud. Who
No,
they are.
that's fine.
But we
I'm
know
just trying
who
to
they are.
quantify where the issue is. So if it's not really that, then is the issue, are you preparing principals then? Because I don't know who's buying down classroom sizes. You know, you have Title I money that that compresses or allows us to have smaller classes with the Title I funds, because the school or I'm assuming a whole school qualifies, so therefore, they're going to put the resources where they need. Are the principals then using school-based funds? And I'm intentionally making this maybe a little bit more elementary because there is a misunderstanding of how this happens. So I'm just trying to get it explained. Are the principals then taking school-based funds and further buying down class sizes with latitude right now that you're proposing that they're not going to have as much of come the fall?
Yes and no. It could also be a function of like our immersion classes. Sometimes they're artificially below this number because as they go up in the grade level, sometimes you don't have the right number of students and parents that want to be in the immersion classes. So I would say yes. In some cases, we have in and out that occurs all throughout the year. So maybe on October the 31st, when this report was run, we could have had a class that we had 3 or 4 withdrawals, and all of a sudden it made it go under that, but it wasn't a function of the fact that a principal made a decision to hire additional teacher. It's different on a case-by-case basis. Some have knowingly, you can look at class size and you know full well that's how the principals used quite a bit of their Title I money. So it's really just, it depends upon the school and the situation.
Okay. And then you had said that there were 3,505 elementary classrooms that are, is that 3,505 that are non-special ed? That's 3,505 overall, 3,505 including AAP. Is that a composite number?
It is all elementary, grades 1 through 6, with special ed L2 students, and it also includes AAP students.
So that number doesn't include things like when we have a self-contained class. So that's over there.
Right.
We're just
That's
talking
correct.
about the majority of the classrooms. Okay. So one of the concerns that I have then is, when you hear about teacher workload and changing demographics or initiative weary, which are things from the past, which we're getting better about. I am concerned about the equitable use of our facilities across the division, the teacher workload on teachers throughout the division, where somewhere in the division you could have a third grade teacher who has 19 or 22 students and another that has 30. And what that means in terms of how many parent-teacher conferences you have, and contact, and grades, and assessments, and report cards, and the whole works. So it's as if there's two ends of a seesaw here. The one end are the classroom caps, and I've got to laud and praise you for saying, you know what, and the one thing that this presentation was missing is what the state mandates were. I kept hoping that I was going to say, okay, we're going to max it out at 30. The state says it could be whatever, X. So maybe in the future on a next step we could add how we're bettering, because that's kind of like that's the bar of mediocrity is what the state says, and what you're saying is we're going to do better in Fairfax because we're going to lower those caps at the upper end of the grades, correct?
And I'm hoping down the road we can lower it even further, but 35 I think you said was the state cap.
And then you're going to make it 30?
30.
30.
At grades, at the upper grades.
Upper grades. See, those are important things to emphasize. Is the state is saying this, and we're bettering, that bar that the state set, and we're going to have higher standards in Fairfax. So that's huge, and that's huge in terms of all of that. But the other end of the seesaw is that class floor, and out of 3,505 classrooms, it's difficult to say that our class average is 23 and a half. When over 1,000 classrooms are 20 and under. So it's as if it's being artificially depressed by a third of the classrooms being on the small end of that scale. So it's almost as if we need a further breakdown that shows us exactly where those smaller classrooms are and an explanation of Why? Because if I can take, you know, all those classrooms that are at 20 and make them 22, how many classrooms do we recapture? And how do we get to redeploy those resources? And I haven't necessarily affected children who are in a class of 20 by going to 22, but I have made a big difference in the classes that are now going to be up at 33 or 34, and we're just going to give them an IA.
I would be reticent to say at this juncture that we need to pull resources out of schools where they have lower class sizes. I get that, that there's challenges certainly with larger class size. I think we're making, as you pointed out, big step in the right direction. Also know that in the schools where we tend to have a little bit lower class sizes, we have some of our greatest instructional challenges. And so I think down the road, we certainly need to take that on. I think pulling some of the resource out at the start of the school year will help mitigate some of that, keeping a tighter control over some of our enrollment figures. And down the road, we may be in a position where we have to do, control more of that, but I'd be reticent to do it at this point.
Well, and then it becomes a question of what is the educational impact difference of taking a classroom at 20 to 22? Well, this is a lot of money, and we're going to have a problem, and we're going to have to roll up our sleeves. And I know the Board of Supervisors goes down to the individual line item level each when things get difficult after Mr. Long is going to release this. And the question is how we're going to find the money, and we're going to have some difficult conversations. So.
And I'll tell you, Ms. Schultz, down the road, it has been on our mind that we may have to consider that. But if we were to raise the floor, the promise to not cut school budgets and the strain that we're hearing from all of our schools was certainly on our minds. And if we were to raise the floor to 19, that's automatically going to cut staffing and resource to our schools. And I just felt like, as Ms. Schultz pointed out, we may have to do that at some point. I think we were trying to protect our schools from those cuts at this particular juncture for lots of different reasons. But it would materialize in real cuts to our schools.
Well, I agree we have to be stubborn about our goals, but I think we got to be flexible about our methods. And very small class sizes, at some point we're going to have to assess, is there an educational return at some level that's really quite small that we're not getting the benefit of, and that we're going to have to use those resources and maybe in a different way. Not that we're not taking away resources, but we're redeploying them in a different way. And I will continue this conversation. I do think we're going to have to, as board members, do a little bit of figuring out what the priorities are when we get some news from the Board of Supervisors. And I don't hear anybody else talking about where the line items are. So.
I don't want to make their job easy for them either, because they've been underfunding our school system for many years.
I don't know.
And so
they need to give us whatever money they need to give it. But the question is how we're deploying it here becomes our choice, and it becomes a board priority. And I think we have to have the discussion. So thank you.
Well, it seems clear to me, if I can just interject, that with the amount of discussion that we've had and the number of issues raised, this is clearly an issue that we're going to need to revisit as a board. I don't think this is the end of any discussions, but let's continue with Mrs. Smith, followed by Ms. Hines and Mr. Stork.
Thank you. It's been a while getting here when you want to say something. So, there's so many things I could say that don't matter. This is so complex. This is not black and white. It's not about a number on a sheet. It's about kids in the classroom and relationships and decision making. So the thing I appreciate the most is that you're going to watch this process, you're going to be flexible, but you're going to provide oversight. We are looking at culture changes because principals have used their staffing to meet the needs and have done trades if they want a extra reading specialist. So you guys are aware of that, but we're aware of that here too. And as you manage that, if things bubble up to us, I think we need to have an understanding that we're doing the best for kids, have flexibility where we want, but we're going to have to hold you to things at certain times. So I guess that made me question, where is your timing of that? Because you don't want to get in 10 days and tell somebody, shouldn't have gotten that reading specialist. So is that part of the process more in August or something where you're going to, somebody's going to oversee what's happening with the principals?
So, as Dr. Garza said a little bit earlier in terms of the enrollment, so we will be watching that enrollment prior to the August staffing meetings, particularly in July, to see how close folks are. When we do have the staffing meetings in August, it is, you know, is this realistic? And then what is the risk that you're willing to take? You know, because we've been in situations where we have had to pull teachers. As you said, that's not been the culture, but we have done that. There are some communities that have said, oh yeah, we reorganized after school started this year. I know that there's some in your community as well. So doing that earlier will be important for us, for all.
Ms. Smith, on that too, we're well aware of the perennial schools that we've had challenges with. At staffing, we're also this year going to be providing in that discussion with the regional superintendents, regional assistant superintendents, the 5-year numbers. So it's not just this year's number. We're looking at where we were enrollment projections and their actuals over the last 4 years plus this year. So they'll have 5 years worth of data that helps shape that conversation. And we will be, you know, I think we've been very clear with the regional assistant superintendents. We're going to be very careful about trades in those schools where we've perennially been over these numbers. And it's not all schools. We know, you know, some of them are going to, you know, be okay, and we can release their ability to trade in a position here or there, but it's going to be fewer in number. No doubt. The cultural change is also very important to point out. You know, I've talked about this with principals quite a bit. I think we all long for the day and times when resources were not of issue and, you know, salary, you know, we got step and market scale adjustments every year. We had all the staffing we could possibly use. You know, those days are long gone. And so we have to have some controls over these that are reasonable so that we can, you know, be accountable to our community about how we're utilizing these resources. And so I think it is a struggle for some of our principals as we talk about how we have more quality control.
You know, one of the other terms that we're using is the term cap. And I think sometimes that's a hard term because I remember the days when we did have there was a 25 cap in first grade and you were getting a new teacher no matter what, any time of the year. What I'm hearing you say is there's going to be flexibility in decision-making of what to do depending on the time of year when something happens and talking with the community. So that's a little conflict in hearing the word cap, because when I hear the word cap, I think, okay, 36 students and it's March, we're going to get a new teacher and move everybody into different classrooms. But what I'm hearing you say is really there'll be flexibility with that, or not.
Where the flexibility, we're going to uphold our promise to the community. We're saying these are our maximum, these are our maximums. Now, how we address those maximums, we have some flexibility. As was pointed out earlier, we could put an instructional assistant in every classroom. Or we could say, let's not do that, let's add another teacher and let's balance out the classes. So I think that's where the flexibility is, and I think certainly what time of year it happens has to be a factor in that conversation. So we're going to honor what we say, you know, would be our caps, you know, our maximums, with this, you know, articulated flexibility above that. And we're going to provide them additional resource. And how we respond to that, whether it be, you know, these different configurations, that's where the flexibility, I think, exists.
And that's where I'm thinking you might have another teacher, but you might not divide all the classes up too late in the year, depending. So that's what I want to hear, is there's going to be flexibility to best meet the needs of the kids. I'm happy to hear where there's going to be an analysis of what's happening as we move forward. And Mrs. Strauss brought up the issue that does get raised when you sit here and you're trying to visualize it. You don't want to end up then overstaffing a school, because all of a sudden you hired 4 IAs and then you're going to hire a teacher. And so there'll have to be some balancing and figuring out. I think you can hear the discussion with the board here. It's very easy to want to sit here and figure out all the things that are going to happen and know the answers. But I think this is one of the things I think you've made an honest effort in a reasonable amount of money to try to deal with a problem that we've heard from the community with really large class sizes. And we're going to have to sit back a little bit and you know, trust, but then hear from you later that you're going to have a process to meet the needs for kids. So I do appreciate what you're doing here. Thank you.
Okay, we have Ms. Hines, followed by Mr. Stork.
Well, the nice thing about going late is that almost all my questions have been asked and answered. So, but I would say also that I do really appreciate this. As you know, this has been an issue in Vienna and other parts of my neck of the woods. And we tried last year, and it didn't really work out, you know, but that's the problem when, you know, and even tonight we realize we're making these plans and we're doing our best, but when it comes down to it, we'll see September 28th, you know, what it really looks like. But this is because we're putting some resources behind it and actually making some changes in the way we make decisions. I feel more hopeful this year than I think I was last year, or that, you know, as it worked out. So just a couple things. And I know now every time we say combination class, you probably cringe, right? But I thought I would just say another perspective, my own perspective, having taught a combination class and having actually one of my children have 2 combination classes in their time in the school system. I believe it can really be fine. I mean, I think that properly put together and well supported, I would rather have a combination of 25 than a single grade of 35 as a teacher. And I would rather have my kid in that class as well. So if that's a choice that a principal has to make, I'll support it all the way. You know, so talking a little bit about special ed, because you did mention that these CAP numbers will include special education students. And I just wanted a little bit of clarity about that, because this year I felt like there was some uncertainty about how we count special education students or don't. And I guess that depends on what category of special education student they are. So let's think of an example where we have, so let's say in a math class for 3rd grade, it looks like the CAP will be 27 for math, because that's a core area, right? So that means that if I am a special education teacher and I push a student in to that core math class and that makes 28, then that class has an IA. Is that what I'm understanding?
That is correct.
Okay, so that's whether those special education students are self-contained most of the day and pushed in for core classes, or whether they are mainstreamed in the general education class and pulled out, pushed in. That's what, doesn't matter what category the special education student is, you'll never have more than that number in a core class.
And that's why we describe it as any class or any class configuration or instructional configuration.
Okay, all right,
So
thank
the
you.
answer, your example was a good one, that could not occur.
That school gets some extra resources there. That's good. Okay. Let me see. There was just one other thing. Oh, maybe not. Maybe I'll hit everything I was going to ask. Well, just the other thing I would just say is that, you know, this is good news. It's good work. It's advancing us. But, you know, let's not forget, we are still talking about class sizes of 35 in elementary schools. So, you know, this is, you know, incrementally better, but we have a long way to go. And I, for one, do not accept this as the new normal. We have to continue to fight to do better for our kids.
27 and 30.
I'm sorry, yes, okay. 20,
35 is the state maximum.
Cap. Okay, and that's, you're right, I'm sorry, 27 and 30, right, but even.
But your point's a good one. It's still not where we need to be.
Right, and we will have classes in 4th through 6th grade with 35 kids and 2 adults. Right, so that is still possible. And that's a crowded room, you know, so thanks. Mr. Stork.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions, and maybe to start with, I wanted to see, Dr. Garza, we've been talking a little bit about the priority schools tonight, and I know that's something that you all have been working on, and just wanted to get some sense of when that's likely to be coming to the board for a little bit more elaboration and clarity discussion about what you're looking to do? Or somebody, yeah.
We're working on that right now. In fact, some of it has to do with current staffing. I know Dr. Pajara, we're working through like instructional coaches, and some of that money has been spent for instructional coaches, so we're working kind of through that. We have to have those decisions probably in the next month or so. So I would say in the next couple of months, we'll be in a position to talk with you about which schools they will be, what's our instructional improvement strategy for the different tiers of schools, what kinds of additional resources would be allocated to those schools, and we'll also talk about, where we have vacancies in leadership positions, how we, propose to address those.
Okay, and that would mean a work session that this would be brought to, and we would spend time to go through it that way. Look forward to it. I know we've learned some things over the last few years with the model that we've had. I know that we're all interested in, and I think there's opportunities for improvement, and I guess I would just echo, I'm looking forward to whatever you'll be presenting, but I also want to know that we'll be getting some sort of final report on the PSI, the private school initiative that we've had, and because that was part of what the board is looking for, and so I don't need an answer tonight, but I would just ask the board chair and yourself to, if you could include some kind of update on that as to when we'll likely see that in terms of what future work session, or if it's an initial release or what that might be. So thank you. The second thing I wanted to mention, or actually ask about, has to do with something that's really been part of the Priority School Initiative from the beginning. That is the front of the line opportunity that the neediest schools, the priority schools, get in terms of the hiring process. Do we have any information, data, anything that would give us some sense of the value or the kind of the benefit or the bottom line impact that it's had on schools? Any, if either anecdotal, or if not, my preference obviously would be something more evidential than anecdotal, but something that would give us some sense of what, if we see any kind of sense of the value of that, given that that's one of the things we're looking at here as a model to reinforce and continue.
We were actually just talking about this, I think yesterday at our HR leadership meeting, in terms of us being able to quantify the value added by that first crack at the early hires, or the not having to take a D-staff in a core content area. We have not quantified that, Mr. Stork, other than being able to say these teachers stayed at the school as well. I could, make some assertions just based upon belief of teacher quality, and people knowing earlier who they'll be working with, and that teacher being able to get acclimated to the school and the school environment. But we have not collected specific data on that as of yet, but we will put that down to do so.
Clearly there's value. We all recognize the benefit of that. If you're in front of the line and you get your choice of essentially everybody that's out there, but if there's something more there, and I'm not looking for a study or anything else, but just if there's any kind of sense of how we see that, in terms of any kind of assessment or results that we see in the schools themselves.
I thought you were referring to that we've provided an opportunity for priority schools in the past to some kind of hiring advantage, and
Yes.
Okay, and you're speaking of the access to these early hires, right? Contract folks. I think what's different this time is the fact that they're the first ones out of the gate, and it's much earlier in the year. I think that's what we're hearing from principals. The second is, once they offer, we're not going to allow a teacher, once you've committed to a school, you can't hold out and then say, oh, by the way, I've changed my mind, I'm going to go I've got an offer over here.
With another school within FCPS.
That's correct. That's correct. And so we've heard from principals time and time again, particularly the schools that struggle. I mean, they're fighting to get quality teachers.
Exactly.
And they're competing against other schools in FCPS and many times. And so we're trying to be responsive to some of those needs. But down the road, I think there's some other things we can do as well.
And that's really the core issue. And then you kind of alluded to one of the other issues I was going to bring up related to this, and I know that's been a subject of conversation that I've had with many of you, which is how do we change at least the expectation on the part of the school system about how long a teacher would stay at a school, and because that ultimately is what really matters, because we know that an in and out teacher is not going to have the impact of somebody who's been there longer. And if we can get the best teachers to commit to our neediest schools and we keep them longer, then theoretically the results should be significantly better than what the alternative would have been. So I know I recognize this isn't part of this conversation, but I would, if I would at least pose this question now and have it at least addressed and when the new priority school process is unveiled, I think that's, to me, is maybe the most important thing that we could do to change some of that dynamic and improve some of the outcomes.
We have an entire list of HR leadership opportunities we want to take on, and that actually is on our list.
Sure.
And we just felt like we needed a little bit more time to engage the teacher associations, but we really think that we've got to address that, and that is that revolving door, particularly as it relates to probationary teachers.
Yes.
And so we're working on it. I don't think we'll be there this year, but it's certainly on our list.
And I know there's some principals out there that can speak far more strongly to that than I ever could, but I'll be right there with them in terms of the value and the impact, as well as talking to others in the community and teachers associations, others, of why this is so critical, I think, particularly to our neediest schools and the 3 R's that we talk about, which in relationship is number one, if you will, and helping needier kids grow and do better. So I'll just, multi-age grouping at one time was the rage, and actually one of the schools in my community had that, and that's how they got full-day kindergarten, and for many, many years I suffered the consequences of that because there were other schools in my district that didn't have that, and they always said, why not? And so is that like gone from the currently in vogue educational process, or is that still something that's considered?
It is still used across the United States, and when it's done well, parents typically, love it. But it's just like many other instructional practices. When it's done well, in some cases it might not be. Looping is another,
sure.
Instructional design that works well a lot of times. So again, it's all contingent upon, as I think was stated by a number of you, a skilled teacher with the right kind of curriculum support. It can be good.
Are you aware of any multi-age grouping still within FCPS?
We do have some. We have some elementary schools. Sorry, Mr. Stork over here.
Oh, sorry. I heard a voice.
A voice. It's a small voice from over here. I can't even see Phyllis over the computer. We do have some schools that, especially in the primary, that are doing multi-age. And actually, we have some schools that have approached their classes as not in advanced academics as well. It allows them a lot of flexibility with differentiation. And so we do have that. I would agree with, and Dr. Lockhart and I were just having this conversation. When it's well understood by the community and skilled teachers, it's excellent. My children are in the same multi-age classes. And when it's not, it's very uncomfortable. But where it is working by design, it can be quite good, and there's research on it. But the problem is scaling it well. So.
Okay. Thank you. I wasn't sure it still was in FCPS, but I appreciate that. My last question is, you've mentioned several times, and actually the presentation addresses the issue of the staffing calendar, and you talk about compressing and accelerating. Can you be more specific about what that means?
Yes, I can, in terms of just numbers and things altogether. So we had a large group of folks from various departments, facilities, finance, HR. We know that right from the get-go, we have to have our projections done, finalized much earlier. We sent out a memo where projections are going to be due around February 2nd. We would normally turn those around in about a month in terms of looking at what principals project versus what staff would say would be happening. We're compressing that to about 2 weeks. And when that occurs, we will be able to have our staffing meeting. Well, finance will get that, and then we'll turn it around, where finance, I think, has turned it around in about a week. It's about 3 days that they will be turning around information, which will allow HR to have staffing meetings with principals in March as opposed to April.
So it's kind of February 2nd to still 4 weeks later, so March 2nd, and then you're doing the discussions in early to mid-March. Is that the intent?
That's correct.
Okay.
Because to get to that early May open hiring, which again is 6-8 weeks prior to anything that we will have done in the past, we have to have all of those other things truncated. And so we have to still do all of those steps, Mr. Stork and board members, because they're an important part of our where hiring ends, but the turnaround has to be faster and to get to the open hiring in
Will
May.
that change transfer, and what timing expectations you
Yes,
have?
absolutely, absolutely. Transfer initially was scheduled, or we had dates in May. We will be moving that to April now.
So you're truly looking at having essentially before May 1, at least the priority schools, I'll use that, all of them? Okay. Will be ready, essentially they'll know what their staffing opportunities are, what they'll be able to hire for, et cetera.
Right.
That sounds wonderful.
We're trying to beat the other school systems.
Yeah.
To the best people.
I like competition in this respect, so, and hopefully our wages will be someday more competitive, so we can, I know our initial wages can be, but that's still, I know, our other part of our challenge, although we have a great school system, and I know that's going to attract the best and the brightest, even with that challenge of wages, and we'll keep working on that part of it.
Absolutely.
So, thank you all very much.
Wow, thank you, everyone. I just have a few questions myself, and then we'll move on to the last portion of the work session. And my question is about transparency. In terms of the current status, I know, Dr. Garza, you kind of rattled off a summary at the beginning of this portion of the work session. To what extent can we make any of that information available to the public? We probably don't want to get into huge details or, school by school, class by class, but, that broad brush summary, for example, just to give people a sense for, how many, like you said, how many are relatively small, how many are way larger than 30 or whatever. Is that possible to make that available to the public?
Yes, I do think it's possible. We are scheduled to meet with principals in February, and after that point in time, we hope to have the regulation crafted, and certainly, we can develop some messages for our parents and communication talking points for our schools as well. So yeah, we can do that.
But specifically what the current status is as well?
Sure.
Okay, and because that kind of sets up why we're going down this path, right? And so I think that's really important that people understand. And there was a speaker tonight that then asked the question about how will we be able to know where that money goes? I mean, that's not something that's typically delineated anywhere. Like in this case, it's the 3.1 million plus the 0.8 million. How would someone go about finding where that went? I mean, we don't.
So we will be able to track it similarly to what we do now in terms of as we allocate positions out from the reserve, we enter the reason for that allocation. So we'll be able to report back to the board and the public where we allocated out positions for this specific purpose. You can track exactly where they were given out.
That's excellent, because I do think that goes a long way towards just, again, making us as transparent and, as understandable as possible to those people that want to know. At least we can make that available, so that's terrific. And thank you for the good work. It's clear that this board had a lot of questions, and we certainly got into a lot of details. But this is good thinking, and I think we all agree this is work that needs to be done. So thank you all, and I don't believe this is the end of our discussion. I heard some policy issues, too, that were raised that I think at some point we may need to revisit, but certainly not tonight. We'll kind of wait and see how things shake out, right, for these next few months. And I see Mrs. Evans would like the last word, and then we're going to go to the last item.
Actually, it's a question. Are we going to do next steps after this section, or are we going to do next steps at the very end?
I think we should do them now.
Okay, I did have a suggestion for a next step, but let's see what we've got already, and,
We have,
oh, we don't have them? Okay.
right, and so, yeah, that's where I get it. So one is the number of combination classes for this year, and so that's kind of tied to this issue of the current status.
Ms. Goddard just indicated to me they're not tied in to be able to post it online, but they're capturing
Okay.
them. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, one thing I was going to see if people felt it would be helpful, just in getting a grasp on this, since we've talked about it so much, if we could possibly get an example of a school that we think would end up with an extra teacher, and see what that looked like, and we wouldn't have to necessarily name it, but sort of see the data on it to see what type of a school and what type of a class configuration would get an extra teacher, and what kind of a school and what kind of a configuration would get an extra IA. Is that possible to do?
What do you I think we can come up with some example configurations and, I guess case scenarios. If this happened, this would potentially happen.
And I guess I think I would find it valuable if we used our actual class sizes at a school, so we could kind of get a sense of, where we would see it, and because I did have this question about if you have some very small classes at some grade levels and large ones at other grade levels. I'd kind of like to see what, what that would look like if that would end up having an extra teacher at a school like that. Could we use that, have that as a next step, however?
We certainly, as we started to think this through, we were actually going through in the budget office, just looking at some examples. If we had this many students in this class, this class, this class, we didn't use actual schools, we were using hypothetical schools, so we could test a number of different models. But it's certainly something we could look at to give you some examples of this is potentially how it would play out. Now, again, every situation is going to be nuanced depending on the students and other factors, but we could give you some examples.
That would be great, and I would prefer actually having an actual school, whether named or unnamed, myself.
Can I just have a quick sense of the board? Would that be helpful to people before staff go off and spend any time? Does anybody think, how many people think it would be helpful to have staff prepare that?
Any sense of staff time to prepare this? I mean, there may be some value, but if it's going to take a lot of effort, I don't want to.
Well, I'm talking about having 2 examples of case studies.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want them to do every class or every school, but I'm looking for an example.
Is that a reasonable request to staff? Yes?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, so those were all the next steps I heard, unless anyone has anything else. Okay, let's go on to the, let's go on.
The last thing I want to say, can I have the last word on this? I just want to compliment our team. This has been some heavy lifting, and it's so complex. So thanks to Kristen, Susan, everyone that's worked on it, but particularly Dr. Pajardo and her team. You all have done yeoman's work, and it's just beginning. So the staffing season is about to begin. So thank you.
Be nice to us.
And I was just going to,
Mr. Stork?
I was just going to comment about what an easy year they had last year. So this is, this will be, right? I'm teasing, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you all for last year as well, and the full day Mondays. Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's move on to the fourth and final topic for this evening, and that should go fairly quickly. It's to have Ms. Michael review the budget schedule from here on out and schedule for any amendments. Does anyone, by the way, plan to offer any amendments?
I'm at like 60 to 70% sure that I will. But we're again, Dr. Garza and I have a missed meeting from this week that we're trying to reschedule.
Okay, Mr. Stewart?
I've been talking with the clerk of the board about an issue, and I may have an amendment about that. I'm still not clear about that yet. So,
okay.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Evans.
I guess I would urge anybody who thinks they have an amendment to tell us today, since this is our only work session on the budget, is it not?
Right, and so I was asking that to kind of get a quick sense, but now we'll go through the calendar and the time frame, and when people realize how quickly they need that amendment in, that may force their decision one way or the other. So if we could go ahead.
Sure. Tonight is our second and final budget work session prior to adopting the advertised budget. So amendments are due tomorrow, which is January 30th, by 4:30, right? That gives the clerk of the board and the board chair and budget chair to get them finalized, worded, and posted by Monday, February 2nd, right? So the next Thursday, the 5th, is when the board votes on the advertised budget. That does go to the county for incorporation in their county executive's proposed budget. And then we have that joint meeting with the county on February 27th. So their budget will have been released prior to that, and we'll have our advertised budget. That meeting is in place of the previously scheduled meeting in March. From there, we have our formal presentation to the Board of Supervisors on April 7th, when the school board chairman presents our budget to the Board of Supervisors as part of their public hearings. We have a budget work session on April 27th. Then the speakers list will open on May 1st. We will post our FY16 approved budget agenda item for information on May 7th. There's work sessions again on May 11th. Then our public hearings are scheduled for May 12th and then May 13th if needed. We have our final budget work session on May 14th. And then budget amendments for the approved budget are due May 15th. They'll be posted to the board docs on May 18th. And then finally, the board will vote on adopting the FY16 approved budget on May 21st.
Thank you. So now I'll quickly entertain any questions or comments.
So, Ms. Michael, or
Ms.
Dr.
Schultz.
Garza, or whomever, so I have a question about how this pans out, because the linchpin here is, where is the Board of Supervisors adopted? I'm trying to, so February 5th. So that's the linchpin of where this all kind of, we turn down a superhighway that's just been repaved and repainted, or, we get to a 2-lane road that's got some, had a rough winter and there's some potholes, or we find ourselves on like a tar and chip road on the back roads of Alaska, of worst case scenario. And so, we don't know what's going to happen until that day. So everything after that, we may have a wonderful turnout of events from our Board of Supervisors, and everything's smooth sailing, and we have a little bit of dickering here and there, and get to our final budget, and all is smooth. But what happens if we're sent off, off the rails on February 5th? I mean, do we have room for another work session? I mean, how do we hammer things out if it's...
It's not February 5th.
On,
It's a different date. February 5th, we adopt the budget.
No.
The dates that are posted that you're looking at here are just your board dates. In terms of the county board dates, they're not included in this list.
Oh, that's why I couldn't find it.
Correct. So the dates that you're looking
That's
at
what
on
I was
the
like,
screen
how do we get to
only
February 5th
school
already?
board action dates.
So when does the Board of Supervisors in that adopt their budget?
Sure. So the county executive is going to present the county's budget on February 17th. Then the County Board of Supervisors is going to go through their meeting with us. They're going to have their public hearings on April 7th through the 9th. And the County Board of Supervisors is going to complete their final budget on April 28th. But they do have what they call pre-markup, which is when we typically know what our transfer will be, on April 21st.
So why do we have our budget work session on April 27th?
Because
when
pre-markup will happen on the 21st, so we really should know.
Okay, so we're going to know. We're going to know. All right. So that's so really almost that needs to be highlighted. To me, that's the most important date of all of this, because that is either going to be a 45-minute or 90-minute work session, or it's going to be a 9-hour work session, depending upon, good news, bad news, or really, really, really bad news. So, that I think has to be like emboldened up there, and has to be like, we have to be driving towards the 21st, because we'll know. and we'll be coming into that either screeching like Mimi's or, so.
Okay, Ms. McLaughlin, then Ms. Derenak Kofax.
I think I'm in line with Mr. Moon that I don't foresee wanting to do any amendments now. I appreciate what staff has done so far, and I appreciate what Ms. Schultz is trying to prepare all of us, which is that, let's hope for the best and be prepared if something else should change. But I think right now, what's most important is the macro level message, which is we know we need a transfer rate of just under 4%. That is without question, and I've heard everyone to date seem to agree with that, and that gives me a lot of confidence that we're headed in the right direction as a board. And really, that's exciting because this is our 4th budget working together, if you can believe it.
Okay. Ms. Derenak Kofax.
Yes, hi. Perhaps you could answer this question for me. I have, on March 14th, I see on the county's website, and there was some email going back and forth. The county is having a budget dialogue. Can you enlighten? At 2 different locations, South County and the Government Center.
I would be very happy to provide that information to you. And I apologize, we just got this information earlier today. So we had a conversation with county budget staff today. So we haven't yet been able to share this with the superintendent or the board. County budget staff approached school budget staff saying Chairman Bulova was interested in having a day of dialogues. Basically the ability for the chairman, who doesn't have a set magisterial district, to have 2 community meetings, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. She is going to reach out to you in terms of doing this together. And what they would like to do is, this is really similar to what we've done in the past, if we think back to 2010, for example, where we do a really brief presentation on the county budget. They've invited the schools to do a brief presentation on schools budget, and they'd like to break into small groups to do a kind of facilitated discussion where they would ask 2 questions in small groups. They would ask someone from the group to be the reporter and the recorder, and then they would gather that information and then post it back on the web so other people could see the feedback that came from those 2 meetings together. So we will be sending information out to all of you regarding that date. But the county approached us, and it is Saturday, May 14th. There's a morning meeting at 10 a.m. that they would like to do at the South County Government Center. March 14th, excuse me, in the morning. And then in the afternoon from 2:30 to 4:30 at the main county government center. So we will be sharing that information with the board, and it just came up today.
Thank you. I do have one question. How will they be notifying the public, since we are invited, but we're not the initiators?
So we talked about that today with county budget staff. And what we'd like to do is we would like to get both their public affairs office and our Office of Communications together to come up with ways to jointly publicize it. So, we envision doing things like, sending out kit messages, being able to post posters or do flyers for parents. But that's something that we each indicated we'd like our communications groups to really help do to make sure we get the message out.
Thank you.
Mr. McElveen.
So was this meeting, this listening session set up without consultation of us?
County budget staff called and asked if we would be willing to participate.
Okay, I mean, I would say that this is the 2nd time in the month that the Board of Supervisors and the county has planned something without consulting this board, and they should not expect that our chairman or any of us would be available at that time. So I would hope that that concern is relayed to the board, because this is very frustrating.
Ms. Reed, Mr. Velkoff.
Mr.
would like to
Velkoff,
speak.
sorry.
I can appreciate your frustration, Mr. McElveen. I think there are times when you want to reward positive progress, and I think this is a case where I think we need to accept the goodwill behind this, and of course we will communicate to their board that next time we do this, we want to, of course, be consulted in coming up with the date. So I think they're, well, I won't go farther than that. Thanks.
Okay, just one more time, just circling back on the issue of amendments, given that they're due tomorrow, COB. Is anyone feeling like they might be submitting an amendment? And if so, would they like to discuss it, at least tell us a little bit about it, so we won't be completely surprised if we see it tomorrow?
I mean, it's not a
Schultz.
surprise. It's exactly what I've said all along, which is a question of a floor and the number of classrooms that we have that are small. I mean, we got a number under 17, but it's the number of 20 and under that is the real issue. And is that suppressing the overall average down to 23? I mean, 23 and a half, but a third are 20 and under. So the question is, where is that how we're going to do the resources as a priority of this board in this budget? And I appreciate that Dr. Garza, delivered a budget, but in the end, it's our budget. It's not her budget, it's her interpretation of our priorities. And I'd like to hear from the rest of my colleagues that your priority is to have a third of our elementary school classes at 20 and under, and is that the best use of our resources? Because our achievement isn't showing that necessarily that's the best way to do it. So can we redeploy some of those resources otherwise? It's not a question of suppressing the ask to the Board of Supervisors. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with where the priorities are in the budget going forward, not changing the amount of the ask.
Okay, and then I had Mr. Stork. Did you have something you wanted to float by the group?
Well, I just in general, I'll mention it, and then I'll, I guess, either craft something or not. I've had several discussions with the clerk of the board about school board member support, and since I'm one of the more gluttonous members of this board in terms of usage, I wanted to at least make sure that there's sufficient resources for folks to provide the community engagement and support that they believe they need to have. And I understood up until recently that there were still some of the, if you will, carry over some of the money that we had originally appropriated about a year and a half ago. And my understanding now is that that is at zero. So my conversation is, where are we with school board member support? It would be obviously for 2016 budget. So we're not talking about a lot of money, a couple $100,000 or whatever, but I wanted to at least vet that a little bit further before I bring something forward. And I know that I don't have to do it now, but to me, it's a conversation I would like to have now, particularly as we're talking about other parts of school board member needs and support to be able to do their job well, and attracting candidates, the right candidates to provide the best possible school system. So.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin, and then Mrs. Strauss.
Just to what Ms. Schultz was saying, I would suggest that at minimum, Ms. Schultz has done some really good research on this, but it would probably be helpful for this board, if we were talking about trying to shift money around in the budget, that we would need superintendent input on, what her leadership team's understanding is about the class size benefits, the smaller ones, what they've seen to date. And then I would actually see that we would need to probably have a work session discussion on it before necessarily doing any direct changes to the budget. So I would entertain Ms. Schultz's advocacy on that as we move forward, knowing that in May, that would be a very important part of our overall budget allocations and responsibility of the board. But I don't feel I'd be prepared by next Thursday to hear from the superintendent and make a very thoughtful vote on how we would reallocate funding in that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Strauss, and then quick go back by Mrs. Schultz, and then we're going to wrap up.
Right, I would agree with Ms. McLaughlin. If we are looking at changing the formulas for Title I for special education or for extremely high need schools, I would need to know what this was going to look like. I mean, I know, the class sizes and the needs in my own schools, and I'm thinking of those that are a little bit under 20, I would have huge heartburn, some of the neediest situations. But it would be good to understand all of this, but I'm not willing to make a blanket pronouncement right now unless I would have to have a lot more information to know, what the parameters are for some of the other needs.
Thank you. Mrs. Schultz, the last word.
So just in response to what Ms. McLaughlin brought up and my colleague, Ms. Strauss, I hearken back to 3 cycles of the budget, and the board collectively has been reticent, particularly last year, to touch money in May, because by the time we get to May, then everybody says it's too late. So if we don't begin a discussion in February and we don't talk about any priorities and we say, well, we'll just leave it alone and we'll let it go to the supervisors and we'll see, the problem becomes, is there a willingness on this board to actually have substantive conversations about priorities? And it is the only reason I'm bringing it up now is because of the express wishes and desires of my colleagues to have conversations, quote unquote, earlier rather than later. Because if we wait until May, then all of a sudden that same vernacular becomes, well, if we move money now, then it means people's jobs, or it's too late. Well, you know, we're already planning for the new school year. So, you know, we're in a catch-22. If we don't have the conversation now, this week, next week, then it can't be permanently off the table.
Point well taken. And so I guess that wasn't the last word. Ms. Smith? Ms. Hines, Ms. McLaughlin.
I would hate to leave the impression that this board has not had strategic discussions about our priorities for this budget. I think we could all say that our priority is employee compensation. I would say that the superintendent has shared that we want to have a budget where we're not having our employees worried about their positions, and we don't want to be cutting positions. I look at how much time it has taken staff to come up with this plan to deal with how we're going to deal with large class sizes. It is very simple to look at information on a piece of paper and think you can make decisions about the consequences of those behaviors, but I think this topic of the smaller class sizes is very complex and goes deeply into the system, and it's not something we should deal with now. I think the other thing that we have tried to do with this budget, and I think we've done very well, thank you, Mrs. Reed, for your leadership as budget chair, is really come together to have a budget that meets our priorities, that doesn't ask too much from the supervisors. And we all know if we had our preference, we know there's other things we should provide. I do think this is the time to stick together with the budget. This isn't the time to panic and worry about what if we don't get the funding. We will face that time, and I know that this wonderful superintendent will help lead us through that time if we have to make tough decisions then. But this is the time to be together in this. We have a budget that we can stand behind and move forward, and I hope that's what we do on Thursday.
Ms. McLaughlin, quickly.
Yes, I mean, just to what Ms. Schultz is saying, because I've respected for 3 years her desire to, you know, really make sure where are we directing our funding in the best way possible. I think we all want to do it, and she's, you know, always been very creative. But I would say, Dr. Garza, perhaps in terms of the concerns that I'm hearing from everyone, Ms. Schultz laying this out, it just means between now and May, we can end up having a work session to talk about what the research says. And after we get our transfer amount is when Dr. Garza, having listened to us in a work session talk about class size prioritization, in the end, we're not eliminating people's jobs. It's just a matter of where you would be having your ratios. So we would still need the same number of teachers. So I actually think we'd be okay that we don't need to tackle it next Thursday. But I do think that there's a benefit for us to think about having a work session, given the passion all of us have talked about tonight. And what Ms. Schultz brought up is, I think, a piece of the larger question. And my advocacy is just, I really do hope before May that this board gets a chance to revisit this discussion about class size and how do we deliver the best instruction possible to all of our students. And then this is something that Elizabeth can work with Dr. Garza and, you know, perhaps come up with an amendment it's not changing how much we're spending money. It's maybe looking at where the money is being directed and in what way.
I think, as I pointed out earlier, we may at some point have to tackle this. We've, I think, contemplated on numerous occasions that we've asked a lot of the system in terms of changes. There's a lot changing, and the pace of that change is very rapid. So, I would just ask you all to be mindful of the fact that the changes that are going to be put into place are significant, and we really need to work with our principals. And as I pointed out, we won't be done. I mean, we just think this is the first step. Next year, we'll tweak it some more. And so I think from the perspective of we need to be working with our principals now on these issues. If we change the floor to 19, they would technically be reduced staff. So a school that would typically get 20 teachers may get 18 teachers. I mean, it translates into how much they would get. And I just think from a fairness perspective, I think right now, and I'm not suggesting it's never going to be on the table. I'm just saying right now, I would be reticent to support it. I work at your will, but it would be hard for me to recommend a change to the floor at this time for those reasons.
Mr. Moon, quickly, and then we're wrapping up.
Okay, thank you. If Mr. Schultz still wants to bring a motion to be voted on next Thursday, that if you're not looking into changing expenditure figure or revenues figure, then rather than bring it as an amendment, if he could consider bringing it as a follow-on, not that I will support that. I do not know whether I support that, but the follow-on might be a better way to address your desire to have that discussion start.
And further in the process, we will have to potentially, I hope not, because I think this budget needs to be fully funded. But at some point, as Ms. Smith pointed out, we may all have to sit down and wrestle with, we've got to create a balanced budget. And we may have to go back to the drawing board. Last year was very unique because we had so many cuts that were on the table. We haven't been talking about cuts to our schools and departments for all the reasons we've talked about before. So we potentially would have some very difficult decisions to have to make. And it would not be done in isolation. It'd be done in consultation with this board.
All right, with that, thank you all for a lengthy and productive discussion. Thanks to the folks in the audience that stayed till the bitter end. Thanks, staff, for all the preparation. This was a very, very good meeting. Thank you. This session is adjourned.